They never told me about Rule 17 when I started night security at the Vatican. My name is Francesco Moretti, and for 7 years I've walked the marble corridors of St. Peter's after the last tourist bus departs and the great bronze doors seal shut. The Vatican at night is a different creature. Entirely vast halls echo with the whisper of your own breathing, and shadows pool in alcoves where saints carved from stone seem to shift when you're not looking directly at them. But it's sacred work, this guardianship of holy ground. And I've always taken pride in maintaining the protocols handed down from guards who walked these same paths decades before me. Every evening at 9:30, I begin my rounds at the main entrance, checking the visitor registry one final time before locking it away. The leather-bound logbook, thick as a man's forearm and centuries old, records every soul who enters Vatican City during daylight hours. Names, countries of origin, time of entry, all written in careful script by the reception staff. It's a simple administrative task, ensuring the day's final count matches our security records. The book weighs nearly 20 pounds, and its pages smell of old parchment and the faint trace of incense that permeates everything within these walls. I've grown familiar with its heft, the way the binding creaks when opened, the texture of pages worn smooth by countless hands. Each night, I close it with the same reverence I'd show any sacred text, then secure it in the mahogany cabinet behind the reception desk. The Vatican operates on precision, every door locked at its appointed hour, every light extinguished according to schedule, every protocol followed without deviation. In 7 years of night shifts, I've never encountered anything that couldn't be explained by the natural settling of an ancient building or the distant hum of climate control systems protecting priceless artifacts. The peace here runs deeper than silence-aids, the profound quiet of a place where millions have come to pray. Until 3 weeks ago, when I noticed the logbook had been moved. Nothing dramatic, just positioned differently on the cabinet shelf when I arrived for my shift. The leather cover faced the opposite direction, and the red ribbon bookmark protruded from a section I distinctly remembered marking elsewhere the night before. I assumed day shift security had accessed it for some administrative purpose, though procedure dictated they should have logged any such activity. The following evening, I paid closer attention. After securing the book at 9:45, I noted its exact position, cover facing left, ribbon marking page 412, spine aligned with the cabinet's edge. During my 2 a.m. rounds, I checked again. The book had shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The cover now faced right, and the ribbon marked page 415. I opened the logbook, expecting to find some reasonable explanation. The final entries matched my memory perfectly. A family from Germany signed in at 4:27 that afternoon, a priest from Poland at 5:15. But as I flipped through the recent pages, something made me pause. Below the day's legitimate entries, written in fading brown ink, was a single additional line. Johannes Antonius, Roma, Anno Domini. The handwriting was different from our staff's modern script, more elaborate, with the flowing strokes of someone trained in classical penmanship. I stared at the entry for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. Our reception staff uses only black ballpoint pens, and certainly doesn't record dates in Latin. Yet here was an entry that appeared authentic, as if someone from the 1700s had signed our contemporary visitor log. I checked the ink with my penlight. It had the brown, slightly faded quality of very old writing, not the fresh appearance of something recently added. The paper showed no signs of tampering, no erasure marks, no difference in texture. The mysterious entry seemed to have been there for centuries, despite being absent from the page hours earlier. Following protocol, I photographed the page and filed a security report. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to my supervisor, Captain Toretti, who assured me he'd investigate. When I returned that evening, he pulled me aside with a puzzled expression. "Francesco, about that logbook entry you reported, there's nothing there. Page 415 shows only yesterday's regular visitors. I rushed to the cabinet and opened the book. Captain Toretti was correct. The page contained only the expected entries in familiar handwriting. No trace of Johannes Antonius remained. Yet my photograph clearly showed the additional line, though the ink appeared even more faded in the digital image, as if aging accelerated once captured. Perhaps the lighting played tricks, Captain Toretti suggested, but his tone carried uncertainty. In 15 years of Vatican security, he'd learned to trust his guards' observations. Strange things happen in places this old, this sacred. Not supernatural things necessarily, but phenomena that don't fit neatly into administrative reports. That night, I positioned myself where I could observe the reception area without being obvious. At 2:17 a.m., I watched the logbook through the cabinet's glass front. Nothing visible occurred, but when I checked at 2:30, the book had shifted again. This time, I opened it immediately. 3 new entries appeared below the day's legitimate signatures. Maria Benedetta, Firenze, Anno Domini, 1847. Padre Stefano Giuliani, Napoli, Anno Domini 1592. Isabella Corsini, Venezia, Anno Domini 1701. All written in the same fading brown ink. All dated centuries in the past. I remained by the cabinet, watching the page directly. Over the course of an hour, the entries slowly faded, becoming lighter and lighter until they vanished entirely, leaving only the day's standard records. I began staying near the logbook during each shift, documenting this phenomenon. The pattern remained consistent. Phantom entries appeared sometime after 2 a.m., always names from centuries past, always written in that distinctive fading ink. Some nights brought 3 or 4 additional signatures. Others showed dozens, filling entire pages with names of people who had been dead for hundreds of years. The entries weren't random. I began recognizing certain names that appeared repeatedly, sometimes with slight variations in spelling or dating. Johannes Antonius returned frequently, occasionally listed as Giovanni Antonio or John Antonius, but always from Rome, always from the early 1600s. Maria Benedetta appeared regularly as well, sometimes from Florence, sometimes from nearby towns, spanning dates from the mid-1800s. Research in the Vatican Library revealed that many of these names corresponded to actual historical figures, nobles, clergy, artists who had documented visits to Vatican City during their lifetimes. Yet somehow, their signatures continued manifesting in our contemporary logbook, as if death hadn't released them from the compulsion to register their presence in this sacred place. The phenomenon escalated 2 weeks ago. Instead of just historical names, I began finding entries dated for future days. Not far in the future, just tomorrow's date, sometimes the day after. These forward-dated entries appeared in the same fading ink, but the names were different, more contemporary, sometimes recognizable. Last Thursday, I found an entry for the following Friday. Francesco Moretti, Roma, Anno Domini. My own name, written in that antique script, dated for the next day. The handwriting wasn't mine. The letters were too formal, too practiced in classical penmanship. Yet, unmistakably, it was my name, my city, tomorrow's date. I photographed the entry and waited. By morning, it had faded like all the others. When Friday arrived, I worked my shift as usual, though a cloying anxiety followed me through the corridors. Nothing unusual occurred. No accidents, no incidents, no reason why my name should have appeared in advance. But the next night, Saturday, brought a new forward-dated entry. Francesco Moretti, Anno Domini 2025. No location this time, just my name and the current year, dated for Sunday. The pattern was establishing itself. Each night, my name appeared for the following day, as if the logbook was tracking not just who had visited, but who would visit, or perhaps who belonged here. Last night brought the most disturbing development yet. Instead of a single entry bearing my name, I found 7. Francesco Moretti, Anno Domini 2025. 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 7 entries, all identical, all dated for today, all written in that fading brown ink that suggests centuries of age rather than hours. I've been sitting with the logbook for the past 4 hours, watching my name slowly fade from tomorrow's date, while new entries appear for the day after. The list grows longer each night. More names, more repetitions, as if something is counting or cataloging or taking inventory. The names of the long dead continue appearing alongside the forward-dated entries, but their number has increased dramatically. Pages now fill with hundreds of signatures from across the centuries, a vast census of souls somehow still connected to this place. And scattered among them, with increasing frequency, are names I recognize from current Vatican staff. Captain Toretti appeared 3 nights ago, dated for yesterday. Father Benedetti from the archives has been listed for tomorrow. Sister Catherine from the library shows up repeatedly, dated for various days next week. I should report this to my supervisors, but what would I tell them? That our visitor logbook is maintaining its own registry of the living and the dead? That it's somehow tracking future visits by people who may not even know they're expected? Captain Toretti couldn't see the entries when I showed him before. Perhaps this phenomenon reveals itself only to those it's cataloging. The bronze doors of St. Peter's will open in 3 hours, admitting today's pilgrims and tourists. I'll lock away the logbook as always, maintaining the protocols that have governed this place for centuries. But tonight, when I return from my shift, I'll open that leather cover and find my name waiting for me again, dated for tomorrow, written in ink that shouldn't exist. The Vatican keeps its own census, it seems. And once you're counted among its guardians, once your name appears in that ancient script, you become part of something larger than administrative records or security protocols. I've been here 7 years, but according to the logbook, I belong here for much longer than that. There are restoration protocols in the Vatican that exist for reasons we are not permitted to question. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I have spent the last 12 years as a senior restoration specialist in the Vatican Museum's Conservation Laboratory. I hold advanced degrees in art history and chemical conservation from the University of Florence, and my work has been published in 7 peer-reviewed journals on medieval pigment analysis. I mention these credentials not from pride, but because what I am about to describe requires you to understand that I am neither superstitious nor prone to flights of imagination. I am a scientist who works with facts, chemical formulas, and documented procedures. The painting arrived at my workstation on a Tuesday morning in November of 2023. It was a 14th century tempera panel depicting Saint Lucia of Syracuse, measuring approximately 60 by 45 centimeters, catalogued as Vatican Inventory number 7749A. The work had been discovered during renovations of a storage room beneath the Apostolic Palace, wrapped in oiled leather and bearing a red conservation tag that indicated it required immediate attention. Saint Lucia, as you may know, is the patron saint of the blind. According to legend, she gouged out her own eyes to discourage an unwanted suitor, though God restored her sight as a reward for her devotion. In this particular painting, the unknown artist had depicted the moment of her martyrdom with stark realism. The saint's eye sockets were rendered as dark, empty cavities, her severed eyes resting on a golden plate she held in her outstretched palm. Blood traced delicate paths down her pale cheeks like tears. The painting had suffered considerable damage over the centuries. The wooden panel had warped, creating stress fractures in the paint layer. Sections of the saint's robe had flaked away entirely, and someone had attempted crude repairs using incompatible materials sometime in the 18th century. My task was to stabilize the work, remove the improper restorations, and consolidate the original paint layer where possible. I began with photographic documentation, taking detailed images under various lighting conditions. In normal light, the painting appeared as expected devotional work from the late medieval period, executed with competent but unremarkable technique. Under ultraviolet examination, however, something unusual became apparent. The areas around the saint's eye sockets glowed with a peculiar blue-white fluorescence that I had never encountered in medieval pigments. My initial assumption was that someone had applied a modern varnish or consolidant to these areas, though I could find no record of such treatment in the conservation files. I spent the first week cleaning the surface with cotton swabs and diluted solvents, carefully removing centuries of grime and oxidized varnish. The work was painstaking, requiring frequent breaks to rest my eyes under the bright examination lamps. By Friday evening, I had successfully revealed the original colors in roughly half of the composition. The saint's robe emerged in brilliant ultramarine blue, and the gold leaf on her halo regained its luminous quality. When I arrived at the laboratory the following Monday morning, I experienced what I can only describe as a profound disorientation. The painting, which I had left with the saint's eye sockets clearly defined as empty cavities, now showed the faintest suggestion of restored eyes within those hollows. Not fully formed eyes, but rather the beginning of irises and pupils, as though someone had begun to paint them in during the weekend. I checked the security logs immediately. The laboratory had been locked and alarmed throughout the weekend, with no record of entry. I examined the painting under magnification, looking for signs that someone had applied fresh paint. The brushstrokes in the eye area appeared to match the original technique exactly, and chemical spot tests revealed pigments consistent with 14th century materials. Most puzzling of all, the areas I had cleaned so carefully showed no disruption. The gradual work of revealing the original surface continued seamlessly around these new details. I documented the anomaly thoroughly, taking photographs and measurements. Then I carefully removed what appeared to be the new paint in the eye sockets, returning them to their proper empty state. The work proceeded normally for the remainder of that week. The pattern established itself with disturbing regularity over the following month. Each morning, I would arrive to find the saint's eyes partially restored, always progressing slightly further than the day before. Each day, I would meticulously remove the unwanted additions, photographing every stage for my reports. The pigments consistently matched medieval specifications, and the brushwork displayed a technical mastery that few contemporary artists could achieve. By December, the regenerating eyes had begun to display a level of detail that troubled me deeply. They were not the generic eyes of medieval iconography, but rather specific, individual organs that seemed to possess a wet, organic quality despite being rendered in tempera paint. The irises showed flecks of brown and gold, and tiny blood vessels networked across the painted whites. Most unsettling of all, the eyes appeared to track my movements as I worked around the painting. I began to experience headaches during these sessions, sharp pains that originated behind my left eye and radiated through my temple. My personal physician found nothing wrong during a routine examination, attributing the discomfort to eye strain from detailed restoration work. I accepted this explanation readily, preferring a mundane cause to the alternative possibilities my mind had begun to explore. The eyes grew more lifelike each day, and my headaches intensified in proportion. By mid-December, I noticed that my left eye was becoming sensitive to the laboratory's bright examination lights. I began wearing tinted glasses, which provided some relief but made color matching during restoration work increasingly difficult. On the morning of December 21st, I arrived to find the painting transformed. The saint's eyes were not merely present, but seemed almost alive, glistening with what appeared to be actual moisture. They followed me as I moved around the easel, the pupils contracting slightly, when I directed the examination lamp toward the canvas. When I reached for my chemical testing kit, the painted eyes shifted their gaze to follow my hand. I stepped back from the easel, my heart racing despite my attempts to rationalize what I was seeing. As I moved to the right, the eyes tracked my movement. When I stepped to the left, they followed. The painted gaze never left my face, and I began to understand that these were not merely the eyes of Saint Lucia, but somehow my own eyes reflected back at me from the 14th century panel. The headache that morning was so severe that I could barely focus my vision. My left eye had begun to water constantly, and bright lights sent spikes of pain through my skull. I called in sick and went home, but I could not stop thinking about the painting. In my apartment that evening, I caught myself touching my left eye repeatedly, pressing gently against the lid as though checking to ensure it remained in place. I did not return to the laboratory for 3 days. When I finally gathered the courage to face the painting again, I found it exactly as I had left it, the saint's eye sockets empty, the gouged-out eyes resting on their golden plate. But something had changed in my own vision. The world appeared flatter through my left eye, colors less vivid, details harder to distinguish. I completed the restoration over the following weeks, working primarily with my right eye while my left continued to deteriorate. The painting never again showed signs of regenerating eyes, but I found myself unable to look directly at the saint's face for extended periods. Even with her sockets properly empty, I felt the weight of an invisible gaze watching my every movement. The work was completed in January of 2024 and returned to the Vatican's collection. It now hangs in a private chapel where few visitors are likely to see it. I submitted my final conservation report without mentioning the anomalous regeneration, describing only the standard procedures for cleaning and stabilization. My left eye continues to fail, though no medical examination has revealed a cause. I have been reassigned to work on less delicate pieces, manuscripts and textiles that require less precise visual discrimination. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I press my palm against my left eye and feel the saint's painted gaze looking back at me through the darkness, patient and eternal, waiting for me to understand the price of restoring what was meant to remain broken. There are 37 rules governing Archive Room 77B, and I have broken every one of them. My name is Brother Marcus Webb, and for 7 years I served as senior archivist in the Vatican Secret Archives, specifically assigned to the medieval manuscript collection housed in the restricted wing's deepest chamber. Room 77B sits 3 levels beneath the Apostolic Library, accessible only through a series of copper-keyed doors that require 2 signatures and a prayer of intention before each entry. The manuscripts within are not cataloged in any public registry. They are not discussed during staff meetings, and according to Protocol 15, they are never to be left unattended after sunset. I was appointed to this position by Cardinal himself, selected for my fluency in medieval Latin and my Benedictine training in spiritual discipline. The work was methodical, sacred, and profoundly isolating. Each morning at 7, I would descend through the security checkpoints, past the Swiss guards who nodded but never spoke, through corridors lit by fixtures that hummed with the frequency of Gregorian chant. The air grew thicker with each level, heavy with the scent of parchment and frankincense, until I reached the final door marked only with a small bronze plate bearing the number 77B. The room itself defied the Vatican's usual grandeur. Plain stone walls, fluorescent lighting that cast everything in stark white, and 16 climate-controlled cases arranged in perfect symmetry. Each case contained manuscripts dating from the 12th to 14th centuries, chronicles of papal elections, records of ecclesiastical trials, and theological treatises deemed too sensitive for general scholarly access. My duties were simple: daily condition assessments, photographing any changes in the document's physical state, and maintaining the logbook that tracked every page, every word, every punctuation mark. The first anomaly appeared on a Tuesday in October 2000, and 23. I had been photographing manuscript Gamma 7, a collection of letters between Pope Innocent IV and various bishops regarding the Inquisition's expansion into Germanic territories. The document consisted of 43 pages written in the Pope's distinctive hand, each page carefully preserved between sheets of archival tissue. I had photographed this manuscript dozens of times over the years, knew its contents by memory, could recite passages from the Pope's more forceful communications. But on that Tuesday morning, page 17 contained an additional paragraph. The text appeared in the same ink, the same careful script, discussing a bishop I had never encountered in my study zone, Episcopus Marcellus Webus, of a diocese that, according to my knowledge of medieval geography, had never existed. The paragraph described this bishop's confession to acts of spiritual pride and intellectual vanity, sins that resonated with an uncomfortable familiarity as I read them aloud in the empty room. I followed protocol. I photographed the anomaly, recorded the discovery in my logbook, and prepared a formal report for Cardinal Toretti. But when I returned the following morning to complete my documentation, the additional paragraph had vanished. Page 17 contained only the text I remembered, the text that had remained unchanged for 700 years. I began staying later each evening, extending my observations past the prescribed hours. The fluorescent lights would dim to their nocturnal setting at precisely 6 in the evening, bathing the room in a softer glow that made the manuscript cases appear to breathe in the shadows. I would position myself in the corner chair, the one reserved for visiting scholars, and watch the documents with the patience my monastic training had instilled. At first, nothing happened. The manuscripts lay still in their cases, ancient words frozen in medieval time. But gradually, I began to notice subtle movements not of the parchment itself, but of the text upon it. Letters would shift almost imperceptibly, flowing like water droplets on glass. A single word might migrate from one line to another over the course of an hour. Entire sentences would dissolve and reform, carrying different meanings while maintaining the same essential structure. The documents were rewriting themselves. I documented everything: the time of each observed change, the specific manuscript affected, the nature of the textual alterations. Manuscript Beta 3, a chronicle of the Council of Lyon, developed entirely new passages describing theological debates that had never occurred. Manuscript Delta 1, a treatise on canon law, began incorporating legal precedents from cases that predated its composition by centuries. Most disturbing of all, several documents began referencing future events with startling accuracy: papal elections that wouldn't occur for years, theological controversies that existed only in contemporary academic circles. But it was manuscript Epsilon 12 that finally broke my rational understanding of what I was witnessing. This document, originally a collection of confessional records from a monastery in medieval France, began generating new entries written in perfect 13th century Latin. The confessions described the spiritual struggles of monks whose names appeared nowhere in historical records, whose sins seemed simultaneously ancient and modern. As I watched through the long October nights, new confessions would manifest on the parchment, written in the careful hand of long-dead scribes. And then, on the night before All Saints' Day, I found my own confession among them. Frater Marcellus Webus, the text began, using the Latinized version of my name, Confiditur peccata intellectuale superbiae et curiositatis sacrilege. Brother Marcus Webb confesses to sins of intellectual pride and sacrilegious curiosity. The confession continued for 3 full paragraphs, describing in intimate detail my growing obsession with the changing manuscripts, my willful violation of archive room protocols, and my secret conviction that I had been chosen to witness these miracles. But the confession did not stop with my present sins. It went on to describe future transgressions I had not yet committed, acts of pride, moments of doubt, and ultimately, a betrayal of my sacred trust that would occur on the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, still months away. I photographed the confession before it could vanish, though I knew from experience that digital evidence of the anomalies rarely survived the night. As I worked, I became aware that other manuscripts throughout the room were also shifting, their texts flowing like rivers of ink. Chronicles were rewriting themselves to include my presence at historical events I had never attended. Theological treatises began incorporating arguments I had made only in my private prayers. Papal letters addressed themselves to me by name, seeking my counsel on matters of faith and doctrine. The room had become aware of me. The documents were not simply changing, they were communicating, reaching across centuries to establish a connection that violated every natural law I understood. And at the center of this impossible conversation was my own confession, growing longer each night, documenting sins I had not yet committed but somehow knew I would. I understood, finally, why Archive Room 77B required 37 rules for safe operation. The manuscripts were not mere historical documents, they were living records, constantly writing and rewriting the story of the Church, incorporating new information as it became available across time. And I, by observing them so closely, by staying past the prescribed hours, by allowing my curiosity to override my caution, had become part of their narrative. The confession predicted that I would attempt to share my discoveries with Cardinal Toretti on the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. It described my growing conviction that the Church needed to know about the living documents, my belief that I had uncovered proof of divine intervention in human history. And it foretold the Cardinal's response, the gentle questioning, the concerned expressions, the quiet reassignment to a small parish in rural Montana, where I would spend my remaining years tending to the spiritual needs of farmers and their families. I never wrote my report to Cardinal Toretti. On the morning of January 28th, the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas, I submitted my resignation from the Vatican archives and requested a transfer to pastoral ministry. The Cardinal accepted my request without question, as if he had been expecting it, as if it had been written somewhere, long ago, in perfect medieval Latin. Brother Francis took over my duties in Archive Room 77B. During the brief transition period, he mentioned that the manuscripts seemed remarkably stable, showing no signs of the deterioration that had concerned my predecessors. I smiled and wished him well, knowing that the documents would remain still and silent as long as he followed the 37 rules that govern their keeping. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn here in Montana, I wonder what new confessions are being written in that white-lit room beneath the Vatican. I wonder whose name appears now in 13th century script, whose future sins are being documented by scribes who never sleep, who never die, who never stop writing the long, strange story of human failing and divine grace. They say the dying speak truest in their final breath, but no one prepared me for what the cardinals would whisper. My name is Father Antonio Benedetti, and for 7 years I served as the Vatican's designated minister for Cardinal Last Retessa position that exists in no official capacity but carries the weight of centuries. When a prince of the Church lies dying within these walls, I am summoned. I carry the sacred oils, speak the ancient words, and guide their souls toward judgment. It is both honor and burden, performed in chambers where even the marble seems to hold its breath. The Vatican teaches us that death is transition, not ending. In the Apostolic Palace's medical wing, I learned this truth in ways the seminary never intended. The dying cardinal's quarters occupy the third floor's eastern corridor, where tall windows face the gardens and morning light filters through glass that has witnessed more last confessions than any priest should know. Each room holds a single bed, a wooden crucifix, and a chair where I sit through the final hours. The floors are travertine, chosen for how quietly footsteps fall across them. Even in death, Discretion matters here. Cardinal Toretti was my first. Pancreatic cancer had reduced him to whispers and shallow breathing when they called me that October evening in 2017. I had performed last rites before, but never for someone whose red hat hung in St. Peter's, whose ring had touched papal hands. As I anointed his forehead with chrism oil and spoke the commendation of the dying, he gripped my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes focused on something beyond the room's corner, and he whispered words I didn't recognize. The sounds were guttural, ancient syllables that seemed to scrape against his throat. Then his hand released, and Cardinal Toretti was gone. I recorded his time of death as 11:47 p.m. I did not record the words he spoke, though they echoed in my mind for days afterward. 3 months later, Cardinal Vasquez lay dying of heart failure. The same ritual, the same sacred oils, the same prayers spoken over labored breathing. As I held his hand and recited the final commendation, his grip tightened. His clouded eyes searched the ceiling, and from his lips came the identical sounds, those same guttural syllables Cardinal Toretti had whispered. The exact pronunciation, the same rhythm, as if both men had rehearsed the words their entire lives. This time, I wrote them down. Over the following year, 4 more cardinals passed in my care. Cardinal Antonelli, 93 years old and weakened by pneumonia. Cardinal Singh of Bombay, who succumbed to complications from surgery. Cardinal Murphy from Dublin, whose liver finally surrendered to decades of quiet struggle. Cardinal Chen, the youngest, at 74, taken by a stroke that struck during morning prayers. Each man, in his final moments, spoke those same foreign words with identical pronunciation. Each gripped my hand as if passing along a message they could not carry into eternity. I began researching the syllables in the Vatican's linguistic archives. The sounds were too consistent to be coincidental, too deliberate to be dying gasps. Brother Martinez in the Oriental Institute recognized the phonetic structure as Aramaic, but couldn't provide translation. The words weren't in any modern Aramaic dialect he knew. They were older, much older. Father Kowalski, in the secret archives, suggested consulting the medieval manuscripts. We spent 3 evenings searching through codices and scrolls, looking for any text that matched the sounds I had transcribed. On the 3rd night, in a 13th century manuscript describing early Christian mysticism, we found them. The Aramaic phrase, written in careful Latin translation, triginta et tres, quindecim, quadraginta et duo, decim et septem, 33, 15, 42. Father Kowalski looked up from the manuscript, his face pale in the archive's fluorescent light. "These are measurements," he said quietly, "or coordinates." I returned to my quarters that night, unable to sleep. The numbers circled through my thoughts like a prayer I couldn't finish. 33, 15, 42, 17. If they were coordinates, what did they mark? And why would dying cardinals, men who had never met, men from different continents and cultures, all whisper the same location with their final breath? The answer came to me during morning lauds. I knelt in the chapel of St. Lawrence, reciting the Psalms, when the arrangement of the numbers shifted in my mind. Not geographic coordinates, architectural ones. Measurements within a building. 33 steps, 15 meters, 42 degrees, 17. I spent my free hours walking the Vatican's corridors with new eyes, counting steps, measuring distances, noting angles. The numbers led me through passages I knew well, but following a path I had never considered. 33 steps from the Sistine Chapel's main entrance led to an alcove I had passed countless times without notice. 15 meters east brought me to a section of wall that looked identical to any other. 42 degrees northeast from that point, measured with a compass borrowed from the Vatican Observatory, aimed toward a spot beneath the chapel's floor. 17 was depth, 17 meters below ground level. I mentioned my discovery to no one. Instead, I returned to the medical wing and waited. Cardinal Restrepo arrived from Colombia that autumn, carried to his deathbed by pancreatic cancer, that had spread beyond treatment. As I administered the sacrament of extreme unction, anointing his hands with holy oil and speaking the prayers for the dying, he took my wrist in his familiar grip. His eyes found that same corner of the room, and he whispered those ancient Aramaic numbers, with the devotion of a man who had carried them his entire life. After recording his death, I made my decision. The Vatican's lower levels are a maze of medieval foundations, ancient Roman structures, and modern utility corridors that few have reason to navigate. Maintenance access is restricted, but my position allows certain freedoms. I descended through service passages beneath the Sistine Chapel, carrying a flashlight and the compass, counting my steps and checking angles. The deeper I went, the older the construction became. Roman brick gave way to even earlier stonework, foundations that predated St. Peter's original basilica. At 17 meters below the chapel floor, I found the door. It was small, barely 5 feet high, set into stone that looked far older than anything around it. The wood was black with age, reinforced with iron bands that showed no rust despite centuries in this damp foundation. There was no handle, no visible lock, but set into the center was a small copper plate inscribed with a single line of Aramaic text. I recognized the script immediately. Below the foreign words, someone had carved a Latin translation in newer, cruder letters. "Those who know the way, enter." I pressed my palm against the copper plate and whispered the numbers, "Triginta et tre." The door opened silently. Beyond lay a circular chamber carved from living rock, its walls lined with stone shelves containing hundreds of ceramic vessels, each sealed with wax and marked with symbols I didn't recognize. At the chamber's center stood a simple altar bearing a single book bound in leather so old it looked like parchment. Candlesticks flanked the volume, their candles burned down to stubs but somehow still flickering with steady flame. I approached the altar carefully, my flashlight beam dancing across walls that seemed to absorb, rather than reflect light. The book lay open to a page covered in the same Aramaic script I had learned to recognize, but these words I could read. They had been translated into Latin in careful medieval handwriting, the names of those who guard the threshold, the names of those who remember, the names of those who will call the next. Below the text, in columns that filled the remaining pages, were hundreds of names written in different hands across different centuries. Cardinals, bishops, priestmen, whose signatures I recognized from Vatican documents spanning 800 years. At the bottom of the final page, in fresh ink that glistened in the candlelight, were the names I knew too well: Toretti, Vasquez, Antonelli, Singh, Murphy, Chen, Restrepo. 7 names, with space for many more. I understood then why the dying cardinals whispered coordinates with their final breath. This chamber had been waiting centuries for each of them to find it, to add their names to whatever covenant these walls contained. Each man had known, somewhere in the depths of his vocation, that his death would serve a purpose beyond salvation. They were guardians of something ancient, watchers of a threshold I was never meant to cross. I closed the book carefully and backed toward the door. The candles flickered as I moved, shadows dancing across names that stretched back to the church's earliest centuries. As I reached the threshold, I heard something that stopped my breath. Footsteps in the corridor above, measured and deliberate, accompanied by the rustle of vestments. Someone was descending toward the chamber, someone who belonged here in ways I never would. I extinguished my flashlight and waited in absolute darkness as the footsteps grew closer. Through the stone ceiling, I heard voices speaking in Latin, words of blessing and preparation. Then silence, as if the speakers had stopped directly above the hidden chamber, as if they knew exactly where I stood. The footsteps continued, fading into the Vatican's deeper passages, but their message was clear. I was not the first to find this place, and I would not be the last. The chamber had been guarded long before I arrived, and it would be guarded long after I was gone. I returned to the surface and resumed my duties. 3 weeks later, Cardinal Martinez requested my attendance at his bedside. As I anointed his forehead and spoke the ancient prayers, he gripped my wrist with familiar strength. His eyes found that corner of the room I had learned to expect, and he whispered coordinates to a chamber I would never visit again. The next morning, I found a leather journal on my desk, bound in the same material as the book below. Its pages were blank, except for the first line, written in elegant Latin script. Father Antonio Benedetti, guardian of the Eastern Corridor, keeper of the final words. I have never spoken of the chamber to another soul. When cardinals die in my care, I record their time of death, and nothing more. But I listen to their whispered coordinates, and I remember each sacred number, and I know that somewhere beneath the Sistine Chapel, their names wait in candlelight for purposes I am not meant to understand. The Vatican keeps no record of those who simply vanish. My name is Sister Catherine Torres, and for 11 years I have served as Senior Archivist in the Apostolic Archives Audio Conservation Division. My duties are precise and sacred: to catalog, preserve, and maintain the recorded voice of every pope since the introduction of electrical recording in 1938. Each papal address, each private meditation, each whispered prayer captured during moments of crisis, all of it passes through my hands before entering the permanent collection. The work requires absolute silence and perfect attention to detail. I spend my days in Chamber 17, 3 levels beneath the main reading room, where the stone walls are thick enough to muffle even the most passionate homily to a whisper. The chamber contains 47 tape machines, each calibrated to reproduce the human voice with sacred precision. Every morning at 7, I descend the narrow spiral staircase, unlock the copper-framed door with my assigned key, and begin the day's preservation work. The Holy Father's speeches are recorded on magnetic tape, transferred to digital format, then archived in both mediums according to Protocol 15 of the Pontifical Guidelines for Sacred Audio. Each recording receives a classification number, a brief description, and a notation regarding any unusual circumstances surrounding its creation. Coughing fits, the sound of rain against the windows of the papal apartments. Every anomaly must be documented, as the archive serves not only history, but the Church's understanding of divine communication through mortal voices. It was during the 3rd week of October, 2023, that I first noticed the additional voices. I had been assigned to process a collection of recordings from Pope Paul VI, discovered in a sealed cabinet following renovations to the papal residence. The tapes were in remarkable condition, their magnetic surfaces pristine despite 4 decades in storage. The first several recordings transferred without incident. Evening prayers from 1974, a private meditation on the Feast of All Saints, fragments of conversations with visiting bishops. But the 4th tape contained something else. The recording began as expected, His Holiness delivering remarks to the College of Cardinals regarding liturgical reforms. His voice carried the familiar cadence of careful consideration, each Latin phrase weighted with papal authority. Yet beneath his words, barely audible through the static, I detected what sounded like whispered responses. Not the murmurs of assembled cardinals, but something else entirely, voices speaking in reverse, their syllables falling backward through time. I adjusted the playback speed and listened again. The whispers became clearer, though their meaning remained obscured. They seemed to be speaking Latin, but in a dialect I could not identify. Ancient Latin, perhaps, or ceremonial phrases, from disciplines long abandoned by the modern Church. The voices overlapped with His Holiness's remarks, creating a haunting counterpoint that made my hands shake as I transcribed the recording's details. Following established protocol, I noted the anomaly in my daily report and submitted the tape for technical analysis. Father Benedict from the Engineering Division examined the magnetic patterns and declared the recording authentic, with no evidence of tampering or multiple track recording. The additional voices, he concluded, must have been present during the original recording session, though no explanation could be offered for their source or meaning. But I continued to hear them. Over the following weeks, I discovered similar anomalies in recordings spanning 5 different pontificates. Always the same pattern. Papal addresses delivered with perfect clarity while underneath, barely perceptible, voices spoke in reverse languages that predated modern Church Latin. Some whispered in what sounded like early Coptic. Others used phrases that resembled pre-Constantine ritual language. A few spoke in tongues I could not identify at all, their consonants sharp as broken glass. I began staying later each evening, replaying the affected recordings with different equipment, different headphones, different playback speeds. The whispers grew clearer with repetition, as if my attention somehow strengthened their presence on the magnetic tape. I started hearing individual words, names, locations, fragments of what might have been prayers or confessions. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in November. I was alone in Chamber 17, working by candlelight after the electrical systems had been shut down for routine maintenance. The recording I was processing, a private prayer session from Pope John Paul I, contained the clearest instance of reverse speech I had yet encountered. As His Holiness spoke about the weight of papal responsibility, the underlying voices grew strong enough to distinguish individual speakers. 3 different voices, speaking in unison, reciting what sounded like coordinates or architectural references. I transcribed their words phonetically, then spent the remainder of the evening working backward through the syllables, reconstructing their meaning. They were giving directions, specific locations within Vatican City, not general areas, but precise references. 3rd alcove from the eastern wall, in the sub-basement of the Apostolic Palace. The maintenance corridor behind the Sistine Chapel's northern sacristy. A storage room beneath the Vatican gardens, marked only by a brass nameplate reading, "Custodial Supplies, Authorized Personnel Only." I recognized some of these locations from my years working in the archive. Others were unfamiliar, describing areas I had never seen despite my extensive access to Vatican's restricted sections. But all of them shared one characteristic. They were places where no one would think to look for something that was meant to stay hidden. The following morning, I approached Father Benedict with my transcriptions. He examined my notes with growing concern, his expression darkening as he read through the coordinates and architectural references. When I finished explaining my findings, he set the papers aside and asked me to wait while he made a private telephone call. 20 minutes later, he returned with Cardinal Toretti from the Prefecture of Pontifical Household. The Cardinal listened to my account without interruption, occasionally nodding or making brief notes in a leather journal. When I finished, he asked to hear one of the recordings himself. I played the John Paul I prayer session, adjusting the audio levels to bring the reverse voices into prominence. The Cardinal listened with his eyes closed, his lips moving silently as if following along with words I could not hear. After the recording ended, he remained silent for several minutes before speaking. "Sister Catherine," he said finally, "you have uncovered something that was meant to remain buried. These voices. They belong to Vatican personnel, who disappeared during various periods of institutional transition. Archivists, maintenance workers, junior priests, individuals whose absence was noted but never investigated with the full resources of the Holy See." He explained that the coordinates I had transcribed corresponded to locations where personal effects of the missing personnel had been discovered over the decades. Items that suggested their owners had not simply transferred to other assignments or left religious life voluntarily. Personal crosses still warm to the touch. Breviaries open to prayers for the dying. Rosaries with decades worn smooth by desperate fingers. "The voices you are hearing," the Cardinal continued, "appear to be directing us toward evidence of their fates. They are speaking through time itself, using the recorded prayers of Holy Fathers as a medium for communication. We do not understand how this is possible, but we cannot ignore what you have discovered." That afternoon, I was reassigned to a different division within the archive, My access to the audio conservation chamber was revoked, and the recordings containing reverse speech were transferred to a classification level above my security clearance. I was instructed to speak of my discoveries to no one, and to treat the matter as sealed under the pontifical secret. But I still hear them, in the corridors of the archive, in the whispered prayers during evening mass, in the spaces between words when cardinals pause during important announcements. The voices of the vanished, speaking backward through time, trying to guide us toward the truth of what happened to them in the silent places beneath Vatican City. I have learned that some prayers are answered in ways we never expect to hear. And sometimes, the Church's greatest mysteries are preserved not in documents or relics, but in the magnetic memory of human voices calling across decades, seeking justice in languages older than the stones beneath our feet. The Vatican keeps no record of those who simply vanish, but the dead, it seems, keep their own archives. There are 17 rules governing the care of papal vestments, and I have never broken one. My name is Maria Aldrovandi, and for 12 years I have served as the Vatican's chief textile conservator. Every morning at 6:30, I unlock the climate-controlled chambers beneath the Apostolic Palace, where the Pope's ceremonial robes rest in darkness. Every evening at 7:15, I lock them away again. Between those hours, I am the guardian of garments that have touched the shoulders of men who speak for God on earth. The work requires patience, reverence, and absolute precision. Each vestment the albs, chasubles, stoles, and mitras bears the weight of centuries. Some date back to the 13th century, their silk threads holding prayers whispered in Latin by pontiffs whose names are carved in marble throughout Vatican City. I clean them with distilled water and museum-grade solvents. I repair them with threads I spin myself from silk blessed by the Cardinal Secretary of State. I document every fray, every repair, every moment these sacred garments spend outside their protective chambers. The storage room lies 3 levels beneath the papal apartments, accessible only through a narrow stone corridor that predates most of the current Vatican architecture. The walls sweat with humidity, despite our climate control systems, and the fluorescent lights flicker occasionally, casting shadows that dance across the hanging vestments like whispered prayers made visible. Each garment hangs from custom brass hooks, spaced exactly 18 inches apart, numbered according to the Vatican's archival system. I learned the 17 rules during my first month. Never touch the vestments with bare hands. Never allow natural light to reach the oldest fabrics. Never remove more than 3 pieces from storage simultaneously. Never work alone after 8 o'clock in the evening. The rules exist for good reason. These garments are irreplaceable, some worth more than small countries' annual budgets. But beyond their monetary value lies something harder to quantify: the accumulated sanctity of countless masses, consistories, and papal audiences. The anomaly began in early October of 2023. I arrived that Tuesday morning to find Pope Innocent X's white silk alb hanging 2 inches lower than it had the previous evening. The garment, dating from 1655, should have measured exactly 47 inches from collar to hem. I had measured it personally just 6 months prior during our annual condition assessment. Yet there it hung 49 inches precisely, as if somehow the fabric had stretched overnight. I assumed temperature fluctuations had affected the silk fibers. Old textiles can behave unpredictably, expanding and contracting with humidity changes despite our environmental controls. I made a note in my conservation log and adjusted the hanging system to accommodate the new length. The following morning, however, the alb had grown another inch. By Friday, the vestment hung 52 inches long. The additional fabric showed no signs of stretching or distortion. Instead, it appeared as if new material had somehow been woven into the existing garment, seamlessly integrated with threadwork that matched the original 16th century patterns exactly. The silk maintained its original lustrous quality, and the gold threading remained perfectly aligned. I tested the fibers under magnification and found them identical to the centuries-old material. I consulted the Vatican's chief materials scientist, Dr. Romano, who suggested that perhaps our measurements had been incorrect from the beginning, but I trusted my documentation. In 12 years, I had never recorded a measurement incorrectly. The growth continued throughout October. Each morning brought another inch, sometimes two. More disturbing was the discovery that other vestments had begun exhibiting the same phenomenon. Pope Alexander VII's crimson chasuble lengthened. Pope Clement IX's episcopal mitre expanded. Always the growth occurred overnight. Always the new material matched the original perfectly. And always the additional fabric appeared at the bottom of each garment, as if something were stretching them from below. I began staying later each evening, hoping to observe the phenomenon directly. The storage chamber felt different during those twilight hours. The humidity seemed heavier, and the fluorescent lights cast shadows that moved independently of any visible objects. I installed motion-sensitive cameras in each corner, but they recorded nothing unusual, only the gradual lengthening of fabric that occurred too slowly for the naked eye to perceive. In November, I made a discovery that challenged my understanding of textile physics entirely. While examining Pope Urban VIII's white damask stole under ultraviolet light, I noticed something extraordinary in the newly grown fabric. The threads had been arranged to form letters, not embroidered or appliqued, but woven directly into the material's structure. Latin words spelled out in silk, Corpus Nostrum Mene, repeated in microscopic script along the stole's extended edge, our body remains. I found similar inscriptions in all the affected vestments. Pope Innocent's alb contained the phrase Memoriam Aeternam woven into its lower hem. Pope Alexander's chasuble bore the words Spiritus Permanet in golden thread so fine I needed a magnifying glass to read it. Each inscription appeared to be integrated into the original weaving pattern, as if the papal garments were writing themselves. The hair came next. I discovered the first strand while examining Pope Clement's mitre in early December. A single white hair, approximately 4 inches long, caught in the silk fibers near the base of the hat. The hair appeared fresh, not brittle like ancient organic material should be. I preserved it in a sealed sample container and sent it to the Vatican's forensic laboratory for analysis. Dr. Romano called me 3 days later with results that made no sense. The hair showed no signs of aging despite containing no modern chemical treatments. The DNA analysis revealed genetic markers consistent with 17th century European populations, yet the cellular structure remained remarkably well preserved. Most puzzling of all, the hair contained trace amounts of chrism oil, the sacred oil used in papal consecrations, despite being sent to the laboratory in a sterile container. More hair appeared throughout December. Silver strands in Pope Innocent's alb, brown hair woven through Pope Alexander's chasuble. Each sample sent to the laboratory returned similar impossible results. Ancient genetics, modern preservation, traces of sacred oils that should have degraded centuries ago. By Christmas, I understood that I was witnessing something beyond conservation science. The vestments were not simply growing, they were being worn. Each night, after I locked the storage chamber and departed for home, invisible presences donned the papal garments and stretched them through movement, through prayer, through whatever activities occupy the souls of deceased pontiffs. The hair came from scalps that no longer existed, yet somehow continued to shed onto collars and shoulders. The Latin inscriptions appeared through motions I could not observe, words pressed into fabric by hands that cast no shadows. I began staying in the chamber overnight, sleeping in a chair positioned where I could observe all 17 affected garments. The Vatican's night security supervisor, Captain Toretti, questioned my dedication but did not forbid the practice. I told him I was concerned about temperature fluctuations, which was not entirely untrue. During my third overnight vigil, I witnessed the truth. At 3:17 in the morning, I woke to movement in the darkness. The vestments swayed gently on their hooks, fabric rustling despite the chamber's still air. Pope Innocent's alb moved as if inhabited by a tall, thin figure walking slowly back and forth. Pope Alexander's chasuble turned left and right, as if the wearer were blessing invisible congregations. The mitres nodded in what appeared to be papal benedictions. I sat motionless, afraid to breathe, as the ghostly papal procession continued around me. The movements were dignified, solemn, unmistakably ecclesiastical. I heard no footsteps, saw no figures, felt no presence beyond the fabric's inexplicable animation. Yet I understood, with absolute certainty, that I shared the chamber with the accumulated souls of every pope whose vestments I maintained. The procession continued for exactly 17 minutes. When it ended, the garments hung still once more, but I noticed they had grown another inch during the night. New hair glinted in the fluorescent light gray strands that had not been there before my vigil began. I never reported what I witnessed that December night. Some experiences lie beyond the reach of conservation logs and incident reports. Instead, I revised my working schedule to accommodate the vestment's nocturnal activities. I arrived later each morning, allowing time for whatever spiritual business required completion in the darkness. I stopped measuring the garment's lengths, accepting that sacred textiles follow rules more ancient than Vatican conservation protocols. The 17 rules governing papal vestments remain unchanged in the official documentation, but I have added an 18th rule to my personal practice: never interrupt the prayers of the dead. Some threads bind more than fabric, they bind souls to the sacred offices they once held, creating vestments that serve congregations we cannot see, carrying prayers we are not meant to hear. The hair continues to appear, silver and brown and white, shed by scalps that exist somewhere between memory and eternity. I collect each strand with reverence now, understanding them not as contamination, but as relics, proof that some commitments transcend death itself. After all, once a man becomes pope, perhaps he remains pope forever. Time moves differently in the Vatican, especially when you're the one keeping it. My name is Józef Kowalski, and for the past 18 years, I've maintained every clock, bell, and timepiece within Vatican City. It's a position that demands precision, reverence, and above all, discretion. The Holy See operates on schedules that stretch back 1,000 years, and my job is to ensure that every sacred hour strikes exactly when it should. I inherited this role from my predecessor, Brother Augustine, who trained me during his final months before his sudden reassignment to a monastery in rural Poland. He was a meticulous man who spoke little but observed everything. During our walks through the Vatican's labyrinthine corridors, checking the hundreds of timepieces that mark the rhythm of Catholic life, he taught me more than just maintenance procedures. He taught me the weight of keeping time in a place where eternity and the temporal world intersect. Some clocks, he told me during my second week, his weathered hands adjusting the mechanism of a 15th century astronomical clock near the Apostolic library, measure more than hours and minutes. They measure the distance between what is spoken and what should remain silent. I didn't understand him then. The Vatican's timepieces seemed straightforward enough, ornate, ancient, requiring delicate care, but ultimately serving the same function as any clock. There were the public faces that guided pilgrims and visitors, the private mechanisms that regulated prayer schedules and papal audiences, and the deeply hidden chronometers in restricted areas that I was never to discuss with anyone outside my department. Brother Augustine handed me a ring of copper keys on my final day of training. "These open every timepiece in Vatican City," he said. "Guard them as you would guard the secrets of the confessional." Then he paused, his pale eyes meeting mine. "And Joseph, never wind the clocks in sub-level 3, between 3 in the morning and 4. Let them keep their own time during those hours." For the first few years, I followed this instruction without question. The sub-level 3 timepieces were among the oldest in the Vatican's collection, some dating back to the early Renaissance, others of uncertain origin altogether. They were housed in a series of stone chambers beneath the Apostolic Palace, accessible only through a narrow stairwell that required 2 different keys and a written authorization from the prefecture of papal household. My routine was simple. Arrive before dawn, check the primary mechanisms throughout the Vatican proper, then descend to the restricted levels to maintain the more sensitive chronometers. Sub-level 3 was my final stop, and I learned to time my visits to avoid the mysterious hours Brother Augustine had warned me about. Everything changed during my 5th year, on the feast day of St. Bartholomew. I had been delayed by a malfunction in the clock tower's primary mechanisma delicate repair that took me until nearly 3 in the morning to complete. By the time I reached sub-level 3, it was 3:16 a.m., and I could hear something I had never noticed before. The soft, rhythmic ticking that echoed through the stone corridors wasn't moving forward. The sound was unmistakable once you learned to recognize it, the subtle difference between time advancing and time retreating. I stood at the entrance to the first chamber, copper key halfway to the lock, listening to dozens of ancient timepieces marking moments in reverse. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came from the walls themselves, a voice speaking Latin in the formal cadences of the confessional. The words were indistinct at first, lost in the stone's echo, but as I moved deeper into the chambers, they grew clearer. Someone was confessing to adultery, not the simple transgression of a common parishioner, but the elaborate confession of a cardinal, detailing relationships that had shaped papal politics in centuries past. I knew I should leave. Brother Augustine's warning had been clear, and every instinct told me that I was witnessing something far beyond my clearance level. But the voice was so compelling, so laden with genuine anguish, that I found myself moving from chamber to chamber, following the sound as it seemed to move through the walls like water through stone. In the 3rd chamber, I discovered the source, or at least what appeared to be the source. An ornate confession clock from the 16th century, its brass face showing time moving backwards from 3:33 to 3:17, over and over again. The voice emanated not from any speaker or hidden device, but from the clock mechanism itself, as if the gears and springs had somehow recorded and were now playing back conversations from centuries ago. But this wasn't a single confession. As I listened, night after night, I found myself drawn back. Despite every rational impulse, I realized I was hearing multiple voices, multiple secrets, all bleeding through during this precise 16-minute window when time moved in reverse. There was a pope from the 14th century confessing to ordering the assassination of a rival cardinal, a Renaissance-era Vatican treasurer admitting to selling sacred relics to fund wars, cardinals, bishops, and even saints revealing transgressions that had been sealed under the most sacred oaths of papal secrecy. The confessions weren't random. They followed a pattern I gradually learned to recognize each night. The voices revealed secrets that had shaped specific moments in church history, decisions and cover-ups that had been buried so deeply that even the Vatican's own archives contained no record of them. I began keeping a journal, writing down what I heard in a simple code that I hoped would protect both the information and myself. The weight of these secrets was becoming unbearable, but I couldn't stop listening. It felt like a sacred duty, as if I had been chosen to bear witness to truths that time itself was trying to preserve. By my 7th year in the position, the whispered confessions had begun to change. The voices grew more recent 19th century cardinals, then 20th century prelates. I heard Pope Pius XII confessing to knowledge he wished he had never possessed. I heard cardinals from the 1960s revealing the true reasons behind certain Vatican Council decisions. And then, one August morning, at exactly 3:21 a.m., I heard Brother Augustine's voice. He was confessing to Cardinal Bertoli, describing the terrible burden of maintaining the confession clocks, the weight of hearing centuries of sealed secrets night after night, until he could no longer bear the knowledge. He spoke of the previous Clockmaker, who had suffered a complete breakdown and been quietly transferred to a sanitarium in Switzerland, He mentioned others before him, a line of maintenance workers stretching back generations, all bound by the same terrible duty. The clocks don't just keep time, Augustine's voice whispered through the stone. They keep the Church's memory, and someone must listen, even if it destroys us. The confession ended with Augustine requesting immediate transfer to the most remote monastery the Church could provide, somewhere he could spend his remaining years in prayer and silence, trying to forget what he had learned in those chambers beneath the Apostolic Palace. I understood then why he had warned me never to wind the clocks during those hours. He hadn't been protecting the mechanism, she had been protecting me. But it was too late. The knowledge was already mine, and like Augustine, like all the clockmakers before him, I had become part of the Vatican's deepest secret. I was no longer just maintaining timepieces. I was maintaining the Church's conscience, ensuring that somewhere in the darkness beneath St. Peter's, time moved backwards for 16 minutes each night, allowing the weight of centuries to whisper itself into existence. The confessions continue. Each night, I descend to sublevel 3 and listen as the Church confesses to itself. I've stopped keeping a journal. The risk is too great. And besides, the confessions aren't meant to be preserved. They're meant to be heard, absorbed, and carried by someone the Church trusts never to speak of them. Last month, I submitted a request for transfer to Cardinal Bertoli's office. I asked for assignment to a small parish in rural Poland, somewhere I could tend to simple mechanical clocks and never again hear the weight of eternity measuring itself against human failing. The request was denied. A note arrived instead, signed by the Prefecture of Papal Household. Your services remain essential to the Holy See's temporal operations. I understand now that this position isn't just a job, it's a calling that ends only when someone else can be found to bear the burden. Brother Augustine served for 37 years before his transfer was approved. His predecessor served for 42. I've been here 18 years. The clocks continued to measure time forward during the day, backward during those sacred 16 minutes each night. And I continued to listen, carrying secrets that span centuries, waiting for the day when the Church will deem me worthy of the silence I crave. The confessions never end. They simply find new voices to carry them through the darkness beneath Vatican City, where time itself serves the greater mystery of faith. The Vatican keeps no record of rooms that shouldn't exist. My name is Dr. Alessandro Conti, and for 12 years I served as the Holy See's senior cartographer, tasked with maintaining the official floor plans of Vatican City. It sounds mundane, I know, measuring corridors, updating blueprints, cataloging the endless maze of chambers that house the world's most sacred artifacts. But in the Vatican, even the most ordinary duties carry weight. Every measurement I took was blessed. Every line I drew became part of the Church's eternal record. I was trained at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and spent my early career mapping archaeological sites across Italy. When Cardinal Torretti recruited me in 2011, he explained that my role would be different. The Vatican's architecture, he said, required special attention. Buildings this old, this sacred, sometimes revealed new spaces as God saw fit. My job was to document these revelations with absolute precision. The work suited my temperament. I preferred the quiet hours before dawn, when the corridors echoed only with my footsteps and the soft scratch of pencil on paper. I learned to move through the Vatican like a ghost, measuring dimensions that had remained unchanged for centuries. The Swiss guard knew me by sight. The cleaning staff would nod as I passed. My surveying equipment balanced carefully in blessed leather cases. My office sat in the basement of the Apostolic archive, a cramped space lined with filing cabinets containing floor plans dating back to the 15th century. The walls were thick stone, and the single window looked out onto a narrow courtyard, where morning light never quite reached the ground. I kept my current projects spread across 3 drafting tables, each drawing weighted down with small lead crucifixes to prevent the paper from curling. The inconsistencies began in March of 2023. I was updating the third sublevel beneath the Sistine Chapel when I noticed the first anomaly. My laser measurements showed a corridor extending 37 feet, 4 inches from the main hallway. But when I transferred the dimensions to paper, my ruler consistently marked 39 feet, 2 inches. I checked my equipment twice. The laser was calibrated. My ruler was the same one I'd used for over a decade. I remeasured the corridor 3 times. Each time, the laser read 37 feet, 4 inches. Each time, my drawings showed 39 feet, 2 inches. That evening, I returned to my office and pulled the historical plans from the filing cabinet. The original blueprints from 1948 showed the corridor as 39 feet, 2 inches. Every subsequent update maintained that measurement. Only my laser disagreed. I told myself it was instrument failure, but the pattern repeated the following week in the Borgia apartments, then again near the secret archives. Always the same. My measurements were consistent, but my drawings showed additional spacesmal rooms, narrow passages, chambers that appeared on paper despite my certainty they didn't exist. By April, I had documented 17 phantom spaces across 6 different levels of Vatican City. They appeared on my floor plans with stubborn consistency, drawn in my own careful hand despite my conscious intention to omit them. I began to suspect my subconscious was playing tricks, adding fictional spaces from memory or imagination. But when I investigated the first locationa narrow chamber my drawings placed behind the Raphael rooms, I found something impossible. The wall where my phantom rooms should be looked perfectly normal. 16th century frescoes covered the surface without interruption. The stone was solid when I knocked. Yet as I stood there, measuring tape in hand, I noticed something strange about the shadows. The morning light streaming through the windows cast shadows that bent around an invisible corner, as if the wall receded into depth that shouldn't exist. I pressed my palm against the fresco. The stone was cold, but beneath my hand, I felt the faintest vibration, like air moving through a distant ventilation system. That night, I dreamed of corridors that stretched beyond my ability to measure them. The next morning, I found a door. It wasn't there when I arrived at 7:30. I'm certain of this because I always check the northeast corner of the Raphael rooms first. It's part of my routine, a way of calibrating my eyes to the familiar geometry before beginning new work. The wall was solid, unchanged from the previous day. But when I returned after lunch, a door stood where there had been only stone, not a new door, an ancient one. Heavy oak darkened with age, fitted with iron hinges that looked original to the building. The frame was perfectly integrated into the existing architecture, as if it had always been there. A wax seal covered the lock, not the brittle, cracked wax of centuries past, but soft, fresh wax that yielded slightly when I touched it. The seal bore no recognizable symbol, just a smooth surface that seemed to shift and flow as I watched. I reported the discovery immediately. Cardinal Toretti arrived within an hour, accompanied by 2 Swiss guards and a man I didn't recognize, thin, pale, with the careful movements of someone accustomed to handling dangerous things. "Dr. Conti," the Cardinal said, his voice carefully neutral, "show us what you found." I led them to the corner, but the door was gone. Only the familiar fresco remained, saints gazing down from their eternal poses. I stood in the exact spot where I'd seen the door, touching the wall where the wax seal had been. The stone was warm now, as if heated from within. "I see," said Cardinal Toretti. "And this corresponds to one of your phantom rooms?" I nodded, pulling out my latest floor plan. On paper, the room was clearly marked a small chamber, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, with what appeared to be a secondary passage leading deeper into the building's structure. The thin man studied my drawing with intense interest. He ran one finger along the phantom room's outline, tracing the walls I had somehow measured despite their apparent non-existence. "Doctor," he said quietly, I need you to understand something very important. Some maps show what is, others show what should not be. Your job is to distinguish between them. Cardinal Toretti dismissed the guards and took me aside. Alessandro, he said, using my first name for the first time in 12 years. There are protocols for situations like this. Ancient protocols. You'll receive updated instructions by tomorrow morning. That night, alone in my office, I spread out all 17 floor plans containing phantom rooms. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the additional spaces seemed to pulse with their own geometry. I noticed something I'd missed before the phantom rooms were connected, traced from one level to another. They formed a network of passages that honeycombed through the Vatican's deepest foundations. At 3:17 in the morning, I woke at my desk to find every phantom room glowing faintly on the paper, as if illuminated from within. The lines I'd drawn in ordinary graphite now shimmered with soft light that hurt to look at directly. I gathered the plans and locked them in the secure cabinet. But when I turned around, I found a man standing in my office. Elderly, wearing robes I didn't recognize, with eyes that seemed older than the building itself. "You've been mapping our spaces," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement of fact. "I don't understand," I whispered. "The Vatican exists in more dimensions than your instruments can measure, Dr. Conti. Some of us inhabit the spaces between the spaces. We've been waiting a very long time for someone to draw us a proper map." He gestured to my filing cabinets. "Your measurements are accurate. It's reality that requires adjustment." I blinked, and he was gone. But on my desk, written in handwriting I didn't recognize, was a note. "Third sublevel, corridor 7. The door will be open tonight." I never went looking for that door. The next morning, Cardinal Toretti reassigned me to a new project mapping the Vatican Observatory in Castel Gandolfo, safely away from the underground chambers where phantom rooms multiplied like a benign infection. My replacement, Dr. Sofia Marchetti, lasted 3 weeks. She was reassigned to the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology, after submitting floor plans that showed Vatican City extending 37 levels underground, most of them inhabited. I still work for the Holy See, but now I map only spaces that exist in our dimension. Sometimes, late at night in my new office, I feel phantom walls pressing against my consciousness, unmeasured rooms demanding acknowledgement. I resist the urge to draw them. The Vatican keeps no record of rooms that shouldn't exist, but the rooms keep their own records of us. They never told me that fire could remember the dead. My name is Brother Miguel Santos, and for 11 years I have served as sacristan in the Vatican's chapel of St. Michael the Archangel. My duties are simple: maintain the perpetual flames, replace the spent candles, and ensure that the sacred lights burn without interruption from Vespers until Lauds. It is quiet work, reverent work, the kind that allows a man to find God in the steady rhythm of wax and wick. The chapel sits in the oldest section of the Vatican, 3 levels below the public tours, accessible only through a narrow stone corridor that requires 2 separate keys. The first key, brass and worn smooth by centuries of handling, opens the iron gate at the corridor's mouth. The second key, copper and marked with the seal of St. Michael, grants entry to the chapel itself. I carry both on a leather cord blessed by 3 different popes, and I have never lost either in all my years of service. The chapel is small, perhaps 20 feet square, with walls of ancient stone that weep moisture in the Roman winter. 7 alcoves line the perimeter, each housing a collection of votive candles that burn in memory of the Church's most sacred defenders. The flames are never allowed to die completely. This has been the rule since the chapel's consecration in 1512. Should all the lights be extinguished simultaneously, the protocol requires immediate notification of the Cardinal Secretary of State and the reconsecration of the entire space. I learned this rule during my first week, along with others that seemed routine at the time. Never count the candles aloud. Never enter the chapel during the hour between 3 and 4 in the morning. Never allow anyone else to tend the flames without written authorization from the prefect of the papal household. Simple rules, I thought then. Reasonable precautions for a sacred space. The first disturbance occurred on a Tuesday evening in late October of 2014. I was making my final rounds before compline, checking each alcove to ensure adequate wax remained for the night. The seventh alcove, dedicated to the memory of exorcists who had died in service to the Church, contained 12 votive candles arranged in a specific pattern that had never been explained to me. As I approached, I noticed that the third candle from the left had gone out. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Sometimes a candle burns unevenly, or a draft finds its way through the ancient stones. I struck a match and relit the wick, watching as the flame caught and settled into its familiar dance. The wax around the wick was still warm, indicating it had only recently been extinguished. I completed my rounds and locked the chapel, noting the time in my logbook as always. 9:47 post-meridium. The next morning, I unlocked the doors to find the same candle extinguished once again. The wick was cold this time, and a thin line of hardened wax had pooled and solidified in a peculiar pattern around the base. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Each evening I would relight the same candle, and each morning I would find it dark and cold. I began to keep more detailed notes, recording the exact time of relighting and the condition of the wax upon my return. The candle never seemed to burn normally. Sometimes the wick would be pristine, as if it had never been lit, while other times the wax would show signs of having burned for hours longer than should have been possible. On the Feast of All Souls, I decided to remain in the chapel after my evening rounds. I positioned myself in the shadows near the entrance, with a clear view of the seventh alcove, and waited. The only sounds were my own breathing, and the occasional pop of burning wax from the other candles. At 11:32, the troublesome candle flickered, not the gentle dance of a flame responding to air movement, but a deliberate, rhythmic pulsing. 3 short flickers, followed by 3 long ones, then 3 short again. I knew Morse code from my time in the seminary. Or communications instructor had been a former military chaplain who insisted that all methods of conveying God's word were sacred. The pattern spelled SOS. I remained motionless, my heart beating against my ribs like a caged bird. The candle continued its rhythmic flashing for exactly 3 minutes, then went dark. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my breath catch in my throat. The soft sound of a match being struck, though I could see no one else in the chapel. The candle relit itself. I watched, transfixed, as the flame burned steady and bright for perhaps 30 seconds before beginning its coded message again. This time the pattern was different. ... dash 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 ... VOGS. Then a pause, and the letters began again but rearranged. GOVS. My mouth went dry as I realized what I was witnessing. The flame was spelling names, letter by letter, in the international code that had carried distress signals across oceans and battlefields. But these were not cries for help from the living. Over the following nights, I documented 12 different names, each one appearing in the same methodical fashion. Some I recognized from the brass plaques mounted beside the alcove. Father Giuseppe Volpe, who died during an exorcism in Naples in 1963. Father Oscar Gomez, found dead in his chambers after a particularly difficult case in Mexico City. Father Salvatore Galdi, who suffered a heart attack while performing the ancient rites in a village outside Rome. Others were unfamiliar to me, but when I consulted the restricted archives in the Vatican Library, I found them all, exorcists who had died in the line of duty. Their deaths recorded in documents marked with red seals and filed in sections that required special permission to access. The candle burned without casting shadows. This detail took me weeks to notice. So subtle was the anomaly. Every other flame in the chapel threw normal shadows against the stone walls, dancing patches of darkness that moved with the flickering light. But the self-lighting candle in the seventh alcove produced no shadow at all. The flame existed, burned visibly, gave off heat and light, yet created no corresponding darkness anywhere in its vicinity. I began to dread my evening rounds. Each night brought new names, new messages from men who had given their lives in battles against forces that the Church acknowledged but rarely discussed openly. The flames spelled out their identities with patient persistence, as if ensuring that their sacrifice would not be forgotten by the living. On the night of December 8th, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, the pattern changed. Instead of individual names, the candle began spelling out a single word, repeated over and over. Warning. Then, after an hour of this repetition, it added 2 more letters. MS. My initials. I left the chapel immediately and did not return for 3 days. When I finally unlocked the doors again, I found that all 12 candles in the 7th alcove had burned down to nothing but pools of hardened wax. In the center of each pool, the wax had formed small, precise symbols that I did not recognize, but which filled me with an inexplicable sense of unease. I replaced all 12 candles and have continued my duties without further incident. The flames burn normally now, casting proper shadows and requiring no unusual maintenance. I have not seen the coded messages again, though sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, I imagine I can hear the soft sound of matches being struck in empty corridors. I have never reported these experiences to my superiors. Some knowledge, I have learned, is meant to be carried quietly, like a prayer spoken only in the darkness of one's own heart. The dead exorcists have fallen silent, but their names remain written in the parish records, and their sacrifice continues to protect us from truths that mortal minds were not designed to comprehend. The chapel's perpetual flames burn on, as they have for more than 500 years, keeping watch over mysteries that the living are not meant to understand, but must never allow to die. There are words in this world that should never be spoken aloud, and I learned this truth in the deepest chambers of the Vatican secret archives. My name is Dr. Priya Sharma, and for 3 years I served as a consulting linguist for the Holy See, specializing in Coptic and early Christian texts. The work was sacred to me not because I shared the faith, but because I understood the weight of preserving humanity's oldest conversations with the divine. Every morning at 7:30, I would pass through 3 security checkpoints, descend 2 flights of marble stairs worn smooth by centuries of scholarly footsteps, and enter Archive Section 7, where manuscripts older than most civilizations waited in climate-controlled silence. The Vatican's secret archives are not secret in the way conspiracy theorists imagine. They are secret in the way a human heart is secret essential, protected, and beating with the life of something far greater than its individual parts. My supervisor, Monsignor Benedetti, had explained this to me during my first week. "We are custodians, Dr. Sharma," he had said, his weathered hands folding over a manila folder stamped with red wax. "Nothing more, nothing less. We preserve so that future generations might understand what their ancestors believed, feared, and hoped." The work required absolute precision. Each document I translated was photographed before and after handling, cataloged in 3 separate databases, and cross-referenced with existing Vatican records. I worked alone in a windowless chamber, lit by full-spectrum bulbs designed to mimic natural daylight, surrounded by the faint scent of old parchment and the deeper, almost metallic smell of ancient ink. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat during the long afternoons when I wrestled with particularly difficult passages. For 2 years, this routine brought me a kind of peace I had never known in my previous academic work. Then, in November of 2023, Monsignor Benedetti assigned me to a collection that had been sealed since 1947. The folder bore a red stamp I had never seen before, not the usual classification markings, but something older, hand-pressed into wax that looked almost black in the archive's artificial light. Inside were photographs of 12 Coptic manuscripts, each page dense with text written in a dialect I recognized, but had never encountered in such archaic form. The accompanying notes, written in Latin by someone with exceptionally neat penmanship, indicated that these documents had been acquired from a monastery in Upper Egypt just before the Second World War. They had been waiting for a translator with sufficient expertise in pre-Constantinian Coptic ever since. I began with the shortest manuscript, a single sheet of papyrus covered in what appeared to be liturgical poetry. The text was challenging. The scribe had used several archaic forms that required careful consideration, but I worked through it methodically, speaking each phrase aloud as I always did when wrestling with difficult translations. This technique helped me hear the rhythm of the ancient language, the way the words wanted to flow together. The one who sleeps beneath the third stone shall wake when the bells of St. Peter ring 13 times, I read, my voice echoing softly in the empty chamber. The translation felt awkward, but the Coptic was clear enough. I continued through the manuscript, working line by line, speaking each translation aloud to test its cadence before typing it into my secure terminal. 3 days later, Monsignor Benedetti appeared at my desk with an expression I had never seen before, not concerned exactly, but watchful in a way that made my stomach tighten. "Dr. Sharma," he said, setting down a newspaper with unusual gentleness. "Have you been following the news from Rome?" The headline, in Italian, described a minor earthquake that had struck the city the previous evening. What caught my attention was the subheading. A 13th bell had been discovered in the campanile of St. Peter's Basilica, hidden behind a false wall for unknown centuries. The bell had apparently fallen and struck 13 times during the tremor. Below this, in smaller print, was a brief mention of an archaeological discovery workers repairing earthquake damage in the basilica's foundation had uncovered a previously unknown burial chamber beneath what the article described as the third stone from the left transept. I stared at the newspaper for several minutes, my mouth gradually going dry. Then I looked back at my translation of the first manuscript, the words I had spoken aloud 3 days earlier now seeming to pulse with an energy that made my hands tremble. Monsignor Benedetti watched me read. "An interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say?" I nodded, though we both understood that coincidences of this precision did not exist in the Vatican archives. "Perhaps," he continued, "you might read the remaining manuscripts more carefully, silently, if you don't mind." But I did mind, because silent reading made the translation work significantly more difficult, and because I had already begun the second manuscript the day before, working through it with my usual method of speaking each phrase aloud. This text had been longer, more complex, filled with what seemed to be prophetic poetry about church leadership and the trials that would face the faithful in times of great change. Over the following weeks, as I worked through the collection in absolute silence, I began to notice patterns in the news that made me question my understanding of cause and effect. Events I had translated and spoken aloud began occurring with a consistency that transcended coincidence. A cardinal whose name I had pronounced while working through a difficult passage about ecclesiastical trials was suddenly investigated for financial improprieties. A political leader mentioned in what I had thought was historical allegory was involved in a scandal that matched, with uncanny precision, the circumstances described in the ancient text. The manuscripts, I began to understand, were not historical documents at all. They were something else entirely, instructions perhaps, or invocations. And by reading them aloud, by giving voice to words that had waited in silence for centuries, I had somehow activated processes that reached across time to shape the present moment. The realization came to me gradually, like a fever building in my bones. The texts were not predicting future events, they were creating them. My voice had become a bridge between the intentions recorded in these ancient documents and the world beyond the archive walls. Somewhere in the distant past, someone had written these words with the knowledge that they would eventually be spoken by a translator working in the Vatican's secret archives, that the pronunciation of these specific phrases would set in motion a chain of events designed to unfold centuries later. I stopped eating. Sleep became impossible. Every morning when I entered Archive Section 7, I felt the weight of the remaining manuscripts pressing against my consciousness like a physical force. There were still 7 documents I had not yet translated. 7 sets of instructions waiting to be activated by my voice. Monsignor Benedetti visited me less frequently now, but when he did, his questions had taken on a different quality. He asked about my health, about my family, about whether I had been having any unusual dreams. His concern felt genuine, but underneath it was something else, watchfulness that suggested he understood exactly what was happening and had perhaps seen it happen before. On a Tuesday morning in January, I arrived at the archive to find a new folder on my desk. This one bore no red stamp, no special classifications. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief note written in the same neat Latin script I had seen in the original file. Some knowledge serves best in silence. The remaining manuscripts have been returned to their resting place. Your service to the Holy See is completed with our gratitude. The 12 Coptic documents were gone. In their place was a standard translation assignment of 14th century hymnal that would require months of careful work but posed no unusual challenges. I should have felt relief, but instead I experienced something closer to withdrawal, as though I had been cut off from a source of power that I had never asked for but had somehow come to need. That evening, as I packed my personal belongings and prepared to return to my university position, I found a small envelope that had been slipped under my office door. Inside was a business card for a linguistics position at a monastery in Tibet, along with a handwritten note. For scholars who understand the weight of words, references available upon request. I keep the card in my desk drawer, though I have never called the number. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I find myself wondering about the 7 manuscripts I never translated, the words that remain unspoken in whatever vault now holds them. But mostly I try not to think about the power that some words possess, or the responsibility that comes with giving voice to intentions that have waited centuries for their moment to reshape the world. The Vatican never contacted me again, though I occasionally receive Christmas cards from Monsignor Benedetti, always signed with the same brief message. In silence, there is wisdom. I have learned to read these words without speaking them aloud. There are 17 rules for maintaining the Vatican's bell systems, and the first is never to question why certain bells must remain silent during specified hours. My name is Carlo Rossini, and I have served as bell tower operator for the Holy See for 23 years. I inherited this position from my uncle Giuseppe, who held it for 41 years before me, and his father before him. The Rossini family has kept the Vatican's bells for nearly a century, learning the ancient schedules by heart, understanding which bronze voices call the faithful to lauds, which announce the death of cardinals, and which must never sound except by direct papal decree. The bell towers of Vatican City house 47 bells of varying sizes and ages. Some date back to the 15th century, their bronze mellowed to a deep amber that catches candlelight like trapped honey. Others are newer additions, cast in the 1900s to replace bells damaged during the wars. Each has its own voice, its own purpose, its own schedule written in ledgers that have been maintained since 1523. I begin my rounds each morning at 5:30, before the first call to prayer. The stone steps to the towers are worn smooth by centuries of bell-keepers' feet, and I know each one by the sound it makes under my boots. The mechanism room smells of oil and old metal, of leather straps and brass fittings polished by generations of careful hands. Here, among the great wheels and counterweights, I checked the automatic systems that govern our daily calls to worship. The Vatican operates on sacred time. Every bell has its moment, every chime its meaning. The Angelus bell sounds at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. The funeral bells announce departures of the faithful. The celebration bells mark feast days and papal appearances. But there are other bells, older ones, mentioned only in the most ancient ledgers. These follow schedules written in Latin so archaic that even Father Martinez, our chief translator, admits uncertainty about their exact meaning. It was during my third week of December, 2018, that I first noticed the irregularities. I had finished the evening inspection and was descending from the bell tower of St. Peter's when I heard it. A single clear chime from the direction of the Apostolic Palace. The sound was unmistakable, the voice of Santa Maria, one of our oldest bells, cast in 1497. But according to my schedule, Santa Maria was not supposed to ring until the following morning's louds. I climbed back up the tower, checking the mechanisms. Everything was properly set. The automatic systems showed no signs of malfunction. The bronze tongue of Santa Maria hung motionless in the cold December air. Yet I was certain I had heard her voice just minutes before. The next morning, I mentioned it to Brother Augustine, who assists with tower maintenance. He nodded thoughtfully and made a note in his small leather journal. Sometimes the wind, he said, but his eyes held a different concern. Sometimes the old bells remember schedules we have forgotten. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, it was San Paolo, the deep bass bell reserved for the most solemn occasions. The sound rolled across Vatican City at 2:47 in the morning, a time when even the night security guards pause in their prayers. I was in my apartment then, but the voice of San Paolo penetrates stone and distance. I dressed quickly and climbed to the tower, finding nothing amiss with the mechanisms. But as I stood there in the cold December air, I heard something else, footsteps on the cobblestones below, and the sound of weeping. I looked down from the tower window and saw a young priest walking slowly across St. Peter's Square. Even from that height, I could see his shoulders shaking. He walked like a man carrying an unbearable weight, his cassock billowing in the night wind. As I watched, he stopped at the center of the square and looked up toward the towers. For a moment, I thought he was looking directly at me, but then I realized he was gazing at the bells themselves. The next morning, I learned that Father Gabriel Toretti had requested immediate transfer from Vatican City. He had been assigned to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith for only 6 months, but something had shaken his calling. The personnel office processed his paperwork with unusual speed, and by the weekend, he was gone. I began keeping my own records then, noting each unauthorized chime in a notebook I kept locked in my desk. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in dark water. Santa Maria rang for priests in spiritual crisis. San Paolo marked the loss of faith among the laity. The smaller bells, those cast in the 1600s, seemed to respond to doubts among the Swiss Guard and Vatican staff. Each time, without exception, someone left Vatican City within days of the phantom chimes. By February, I had documented 17 unauthorized bells. Each corresponded to a departure, a transfer, or a resignation. Father Martinez from the archives, Sister Catherine from the orphanage, 3 members of the Swiss Guard, whose names I never learned. The bells were marking them somehow, calling attention to their spiritual distress, like a shepherd counting lost sheep. I brought my concerns to Monsignor Benedetti, who oversees tower operations. He reviewed my notes with the careful attention of a man accustomed to weighing evidence. His office, buried deep in the administrative wing, smelled of old paper and frankincense. Religious texts lined the walls in 17 languages, and a crucifix older than my family service hung above his desk. "Carlo," he said finally, closing my notebook with deliberate precision, "there are aspects of our service here that extend beyond mechanical maintenance. He walked to a cabinet I had never noticed before, its wood so dark it seemed to absorb light. From within, he withdrew a ledger bound in leather that had turned black with age. The pages crackled as he opened it, revealing handwriting in multiple scripts spanning centuries. "Your family has kept the bells faithfully," he continued, "but the bells themselves have kept something far more important. They have watched over souls in this sacred place since before St. Peter's was built. Sometimes, Carlo, the bronze remembers what flesh forgets." He showed me entries dating back to the 1600s. Bell keepers before me had recorded the same phenomenon. Unauthorized chimes corresponding to spiritual crisis. Bronze voices calling out in the darkness for souls in distress. The pattern repeated across centuries, through wars and schisms, through papal deaths and new elections. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked. Monsignor Benedetti closed the ancient ledger and returned it to the cabinet. "You maintain the schedules, you keep the mechanisms clean, and you document what you observe." But Carlo, he fixed me with eyes that held depths I had never noticed before. "You never, under any circumstances, attempt to prevent the bells from their work." That night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of Vatican City in darkness, the whisper of wind through ancient stones, the distant footsteps of security guards on their rounds, the soft murmur of prayers from the chapel where the night vigil was kept. At 3:17 in the morning, I heard them again. This time, it was not one bell, but three. Santa Maria, San Paolo, and the smallest of the ancient bells, Sant'Angelo, whose voice is so pure it seems to come from another world entirely. They chimed in sequence, a pattern I had never heard before, creating harmonies that resonated through the stone walls of my apartment. I did not go to the tower. I did not check the mechanisms. Instead, I lay in bed and listened as the phantom carillon played across Vatican City, marking souls I could not see, calling to faithful whose names I would never know. In the morning, I learned that Cardinal Torriani had suffered what the medical staff diplomatically termed a crisis of exhaustion. By noon, he was on a plane to a monastery in Switzerland, where he would spend the remainder of his days in contemplative silence. I have been bell tower operator for 25 years now. I maintain the mechanisms with the same care my uncle taught me, and I follow the schedules written in ledgers older than nations. But some nights, when the bronze voices call without human hands to guide them, I understand that I am not truly their keeper. I am simply their witness, documenting a vigil that began long before St. Peter's bones were laid to rest beneath this sacred ground, and will continue long after the last Rossini has climbed these worn stone steps for the final time. The bells know. They have always known. And in the darkness before dawn they continue their count. There are 17 olive trees in the Vatican gardens that do not follow God's seasons. My name is Brother David O'Brien, and I have tended these sacred grounds for 23 years. I was assigned to the Vatican Gardens in 2001, fresh from the seminary in Dublin, carrying little more than worn gardening gloves and an unshakable faith in the natural order of things. The Holy Father's gardens span 57 acres within Vatican City's walls, home to countless species from every corner of God's creation. But it is the olive grove in the northeastern corner that has taught me the weight of sacred mysteries. The 17 trees stand in perfect alignment, their gnarled trunks bearing the scars of centuries. According to the groundskeeping records, they were planted during the papacy of Gregory XIII in 1582, using saplings blessed by Saint Philip Neri himself. Each tree bears a small bronze plaque with Latin inscriptions that I have never been able to fully translate, despite my years of study. The phrases seemed to shift meaning depending on the light, the season, the state of my soul when I read them. In my first decade here, I noticed something peculiar about these trees. While the other olive groves throughout the gardens followed natural cycles, flowering in spring, bearing fruit in autumn, these 17 operated by different laws. They would remain barren for months, sometimes years, their branches heavy with leaves, but producing no flowers, no fruit. Then, without warning, they would burst into bloom overnight, their branches suddenly heavy with olives that ripened within days rather than months. At first, I attributed this to soil conditions, microclimate, or perhaps some genetic quirk inherited from their ancient lineage. I tested the soil, adjusted irrigation, consulted with botanists from the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Every expert assured me the trees were healthy, their behavior merely an interesting anomaly. I documented everything meticulously in my groundskeeping logs, as protocol required. It was Father Castellano, the elderly priest who oversaw the gardens before his transfer to the secret archives in 2007, who first suggested I pay attention to the timing of the fruit. He was a quiet man, given to long walks among the roses at dawn, and he spoke in careful phrases that carried more weight than their simple words suggested. "David," he said one morning as we stood beneath the barren olive trees, "the Church keeps many calendars. Some mark the saints' days, others track the liturgical seasons. But there are older rhythms, deeper patterns that run beneath the surface of our daily prayers. These trees know things we have forgotten how to hear." I pressed him for more specifics, but Father Castellano only shook his head and suggested I keep more detailed records not just of when the trees bore fruit, but of what was happening within the Vatican walls when they did. So I began a second logbook, one that tracked the political and spiritual climate of the Church alongside my botanical observations. I noted papal announcements, consistories, the arrivals of important visitors, rumors that filtered down from the Apostolic Palace. What I discovered made my hands shake as I wrote. The trees bore fruit only during periods of upheaval. When cardinal scandals broke in the international press, the olives would appear overnight. During heated debates in the College of Cardinals, branches that had been barren for months would suddenly droop with the weight of ripe fruit. Most disturbing of all, the trees had produced a massive harvest just 3 weeks before Pope John Paul II's death in 2005, fruit that appeared and ripened while the Holy Father still walked the halls of the Apostolic Palace, still blessed the faithful from his window. I began to collect the olives in secret, storing them in the old tool shed behind the greenhouse. The fruit was unlike any I had ever seen, larger than normal olives, with an unusual blue-black color and skin that seemed to shift and shimmer in certain light. When I finally worked up the courage to taste one, the flavor nearly brought me to my knees. Salt and tears, as if the tree had absorbed every sob of grief, every whispered confession, every moment of despair that had ever echoed through these holy walls. But it was the oil that revealed the true horror. I had purchased a small olive press, telling myself I was simply curious about the agricultural history of the gardens. The pressing happened late at night in the tool shed, by candlelight, as if some instinct warned me this work should not be done under electric lights. The oil that emerged was golden amber, viscous, and warm to the touch even hours after pressing. When I held the first vial up to the candlelight, I saw them, images swirling within the oil like tiny windows into another time. At first, I thought it was just the interplay of light and liquid, pareidolia making me see faces in random patterns. But the images were too clear, too specific, too consistent. I saw men in red robes gathering in the Sistine Chapel. I saw voting ballots being cast and counted. I saw white smoke rising from the chapel's chimney while crowds cheered in St. Peter's Square. I was witnessing papal elections that had not yet occurred. The first vision showed me Cardinal Ratzinger accepting the papacy 3 months before Pope John Paul II died. I watched him choose the name Benedict, watched him struggle with the weight of the papal ring, watched him weep alone in his private chambers. Every detail proved accurate when it came to pass. More disturbing were the visions that followed. Elections marked by controversy, by votes taken in anger rather than prayer. I saw cardinals arguing in languages I could not understand, their faces twisted with ambition and fear. I saw papal reigns ending in scandal, in resignation, in circumstances that filled my heart with dread for the future of our church. But the worst vision came during the harvest of 2012. In that oil, I saw myself older, grayer, standing in the same grove at night. I watched myself collect olives from trees that bore fruit as black as coal, pressing oil so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I saw myself drinking that oil directly from the press, my face contorting in ecstasy and horror as visions flooded my mind not of papal elections, but of the end of all elections, the end of all popes, the end of the church itself. I destroyed that batch of oil immediately, pouring it into the earth and praying over the spot until my knees bled against the gravel. But the visions had been seared into my memory, and I knew with terrible certainty that I had seen not just one possible future, but the inevitable conclusion of the path we were walking. The trees have been barren for 3 years now, the longest stretch of dormancy I have recorded. Other groundskeepers comment on it, wondering if the trees are dying, if we should consider replacing them with younger stock. I smile and make non-committal sounds, but inside I am counting the days, measuring the silence that has settled over the Vatican like a held breath. Because I know the trees are not dying, they are waiting. And when they finally bear fruit again, when those 17 ancient witnesses to centuries of church secrets finally release their next harvest, I fear what I will see swirling in that sacred oil. I fear it will be the last oil I ever press, and the last visions I ever want to witness. Father Castellano visits me sometimes, though he is supposedly confined to the archives now. He never speaks, just walks among the barren trees at dawn, running his fingers along their bronze plaques and nodding as if confirming some terrible truth. Yesterday, he left a small leather journal on my workbench. Inside, written in his careful Latin script, was a single line repeated on every page: Arbor vitae, arbor mortis. The tree of life is the tree of death. I have hidden the journal beneath the altar in the garden chapel, next to my secret logbooks. If you are reading this, it means the trees have borne their final harvest, and I am no longer here to tend them. Do not press the oil. Do not look into its depths. Some prophecies are meant to remain unspoken, some futures too terrible to witness. The 17 trees know the weight of sacred mysteries, and some mysteries are heavier than faith itself can bear. There are 17 portraits in the Apostolic Palace that must never be cleaned after sunset. My name is Sophia Komnenos, and I have served as the Vatican's primary art conservator for 8 years. The work requires patience, reverence, and an understanding that some traditions exist for reasons we are not meant to question. When Cardinal Torretti first explained the evening protocol to me, I assumed it was simply to protect the delicate pigments from temperature fluctuations during the night hours. I have since learned that some rules in Vatican City serve purposes far beyond practical conservation. The portrait gallery of papal succession occupies the 3rd floor of the Apostolic Palace, a long corridor lined with oil paintings dating back to the 13th century. Each canvas depicts a pope in full ceremonial dress, their hands positioned in blessing, their eyes gazing outward with the weight of divine authority. The paintings are arranged chronologically, creating a visual timeline of the papacy that stretches nearly 800 years. My workshop sits at the far end of the gallery, a small restoration studio equipped with the finest tools and materials money can buy. My days follow a sacred routine. I arrive each morning at 7:30, just as the Swiss Guard completes their shift change. I begin with prayer, as required by Vatican protocol for all staff who work directly with sacred art. Then I examine each painting under natural light, noting any changes in the varnish, any microscopic cracks in the paint, any signs of deterioration that might require immediate attention. The work is meticulous, almost meditative. Each brushstroke carries the weight of history, Each color holds the prayers of centuries. The papal portraits have witnessed more secrets than any confessor. They have observed the rise and fall of empires, the signing of concordats, the whispered conversations that shaped the modern world. When I work on them, I often feel as though I am intruding on something private, something meant only for the eyes of God and His earthly representatives. The paintings seem to hold their breath when I approach, waiting to see if I am worthy of their trust. It was during my restoration of Pope Innocent IV's portrait that I first noticed something unusual. The 13th century painting had suffered water damage from a leak in the palace roof, and the Pope's eyes required careful reconstruction. I had been working for 3 hours, mixing pigments to match the original ochre and sienna tones, when I stepped back to examine my progress. The Pope's gaze, which should have been directed slightly to the left according to my reference photographs, was looking directly at me. I attributed the discrepancy to fatigue. Conservation work demands intense focus, and after 8 hours of close examination, the eye can play tricks. I consulted my photographs again, adjusted my work lamp, and continued. But throughout the afternoon I felt observed in a way that went beyond the normal sensation of working under painted gazes. When I left that evening, I turned back once at the gallery entrance. Pope Innocent's eyes followed me to the door. The following morning, I arrived to find my easel moved. Not dramatically, just 3 inches to the right, as though someone had needed to walk behind it during the night. The security logs showed no unusual activity. The motion sensors had detected nothing. I repositioned my equipment and continued my work, but the feeling of being watched intensified. By midday, I was certain that every papal portrait in the gallery was observing my movements. I began testing my suspicion methodically. While working on Pope Gregory IX's portrait, I would walk to different positions in the gallery and note the direction of his painted gaze. Without exception, his eyes tracked my movement. When I stood at the gallery's entrance, he looked toward the door. When I moved to the windows overlooking St. Peter's Square, his gaze shifted accordingly. The phenomenon was consistent across all 17 portraits. The dreams began on the 3rd night. I found myself standing in the Sistine Chapel during a papal conclave that had occurred in 1878. The cardinals wore their scarlet zucchetti, their faces grave with the weight of their decision. I watched as they cast their ballots, heard the whispered deliberations, witnessed the moment when white smoke finally rose from the chimney. But I was not merely observing, I was somehow part of the proceedings, invisible but present, privy to conversations that had been sealed under the pontifical secret for over a century. Night after night, the dreams continued. I witnessed conclaves from different eras, each one revealing details that I could not possibly have known through historical study. I heard Cardinal Lambertini's private concerns about accepting the papacy in 1740. I observed the secret negotiations that led to the election of Pope John XXIII in 1958. I watched elderly cardinals weep as they cast votes that would change the course of the Church forever. The painted eyes began affecting my waking hours as well. When I worked in the gallery, I felt their collective judgment weighing on my every decision. My hand would tremble as I applied varnish, afraid that I might somehow dishonor the sacred trust they represented. The portraits seemed to communicate with each other through glances I caught in my peripheral vision, a silent conversation conducted across centuries of papal authority. I started avoiding the gallery after 4 in the afternoon, working instead on smaller pieces in the basement restoration rooms. But even there, I could feel their presence above me, their painted gazes penetrating through stone and marble to observe my movements. My sleep became fitful, interrupted by visions of cardinals I had never studied, conclaves I had never read about, secrets that should have remained buried in the Vatican's secret archives. The breaking point came during my restoration of Pope Pius VII's portrait. While cleaning centuries of candle soot from the Pope's face, I noticed that his expression had changed. The slight smile that had been present in all historical photographs was gone, replaced by a look of profound sadness. His eyes, which had always gazed benevolently toward the viewer, now held an accusation that made my hands shake. I consulted every reference book, every photograph in our archives. In every image, Pope Pius smiled gently, his eyes warm with papal blessing. But the painting before me showed a man in anguish, his gaze piercing through layers of time to judge my unworthiness. I realized then that the portraits were not simply paint on canvas, they were vessels holding the essence of papal authority itself, and I had somehow activated their ancient vigil. That night my dream took me to a conclave that had never occurred, at least not in any history I knew. The cardinals spoke in languages that predated Latin, their faces shifting between human and something else entirely. The voting urns overflowed with ballots that burst into flame when counted, and the smoke that rose from the chimney was not white or black, but a deep crimson that stained the chapel walls. When I woke, I found my hands covered in paint that I had not used Stoker and sienna mixed with something that looked disturbingly like dried blood. On my nightstand lay a brass key that I had never seen before, ornate and heavy, with an inscription in Church Latin that translated roughly to Keeper of Sacred Likenesses. I have not returned to the portrait gallery since. Cardinal Toretti accepted my request for reassignment without question, though I noticed a knowing sadness in his eyes when I explained that I could no longer work with the papal portraits. He assigned me to manuscript illumination in the secret archives, work that keeps me safely underground, away from painted gazes that see too much. Sometimes, when I pass through the Apostolic Palace on official business, I can feel them watching me through the walls. The eyes of apostolic succession, eternal and unblinking, maintaining their vigil over secrets that were never meant for the living. The brass key remains on my nightstand, a reminder that some doors should never be opened, some truths never revealed. There are 17 portraits in the Apostolic Palace that must never be cleaned after sunset. Now I understand why. There are 17 keys to the Sistine Chapel's organ chamber, and I know the weight of each one by heart. My name is Father Raphael Dubois, and for 12 years I have served as the Vatican's senior church musician, responsible for maintaining the sacred instruments that accompany our most solemn ceremonies. The organ beneath Michelangelo's ceiling is more than 800 years old, its pipes forged from lead blessed by Pope Innocent IV in 1254. Every morning at 5:30, I unlock the chamber door with the copper key stamped with St. Cecilia's seal, check the bellows pressure, and ensure that each stop responds properly to its designated lever. This is my calling, my devotion, my sacred duty. The chapel sleeps differently than the rest of Vatican City. Even during the day, when pilgrims crowd the public spaces and cardinals hurry through the corridors discussing matters of state, the Sistine Chapel maintains an otherworldly stillness. The air itself feels heavier here, weighted with centuries of prayer and papal election. When I work alone in the organ chamber, polishing the ivory keys or adjusting the wind pressure, I often feel as though I am the only living soul in a cathedral populated by the faithful dead. The Vatican maintains strict protocols for all sacred spaces, but the Sistine Chapel operates under additional restrictions. No unauthorized personnel may enter after sunset. All maintenance work must be completed before Vespers. The organ chamber door must remain locked at all times when unattended, and the master key never leaves the custody of appointed clergy. These rules exist for good reason, though the full reasoning has never been explained to me. Cardinal Bertoli, who assigned me to this position, mentioned only that the chapel requires special reverence during certain celestial conditions. I first noticed the anomaly on the night of October 15, 2023, during the feast of St. Teresa of Avila. I had worked late that evening, replacing worn leather gaskets in the wind chest, and was walking through St. Peter's Square toward my residence when I heard music drifting from the direction of the chapel. The melody was Unfamiliera complex fugue in D minor, that seemed to weave through itself in impossible mathematical patterns. My first assumption was that another musician had received permission for late-night practice, though I could not recall any such requests crossing my desk. The sound stopped as I approached the chapel entrance. The Swiss guards on duty reported nothing unusual. When I unlocked the organ chamber the following morning, everything appeared exactly as I had left its stops pulled out to their precise positions. Sheet music stacked, in the order I had arranged it. The wooden bench positioned at the exact angle I preferred. Yet something felt different. The air in the chamber carried a faint resonance, as though the pipes had recently been singing. Over the following weeks, I began keeping informal records of these midnight performances. The music occurred roughly every third night, always between 11:45 and 12:15 in the morning, and only when the moon showed 3/4 illumination or greater. The compositions were invariably complex Baroque fugues, medieval motets, Renaissance madrigals that demonstrated technical mastery beyond anything in our current repertoire. Most disturbing was the fact that these pieces seemed to be completely original works, following classical forms but containing melodic progressions I had never encountered in my 28 years of musical study. On November 7th, the night of the Feast of St. Willibrord, I decided to investigate more directly. I positioned myself in the chapel's upper gallery after the evening tourists had departed, concealing myself behind the wooden partition that separates the public viewing area from the altar space. The Swiss guards completed their standard security sweep at 10:30, locking the main entrance and activating the motion sensors throughout the nave. I waited in absolute silence, watching the moonlight creep across the marble floor through the high windows. At exactly 11:52, the organ began to play. The music rose from the pipes with impossible gentleness, as though someone were testing each note for perfect intonation before allowing it to bloom into full voice. The piece was a motet in the Dorian mode, constructed with such mathematical precision that each phrase seemed to predict and answer the next in an endless conversation with itself. But beneath the organ's deep tones, I heard something that made my breath catch in my throat. Children's voices, a boys' choir, singing in perfect Latin pronunciation, harmonizing with the organ in a way that suggested centuries of practice together. The voices were clear and sweet, yet carried an undertone of profound sadness that made my chest tighten with unexplained grief. They sang words I recognized from the Requiem Mass Libera me, Domine, de morte eterna, deliver me, Lord, from eternal death. I remained frozen behind the partition for the duration of the performance, perhaps 20 minutes in total. The phantom choir sang with increasing urgency as the piece progressed, their voices layering upon each other in complex harmonies that seemed to come from every corner of the chapel simultaneously. During the final movement, I could distinguish individual voices, a soprano with a slight tremor that suggested tears, an alto whose tone carried the weight of unspoken secrets, a tenor that cracked with adolescent grief. As the music reached its crescendo, the voices began to overlap in a way that sounded less like singing and more like pleading. Then, abruptly, silence returned to the chapel. I waited another hour before emerging from my hiding place, but the organ chamber remained sealed and undisturbed. When I finally unlocked the door with trembling hands, I found the instrument exactly as I had left it the previous afternoon. The bench sat empty, the stops were pulled to their usual positions, and the sheet music remained stacked in its precise order. Yet the wooden keys bore the faint impression of human fingers, and the pedals showed traces of movement in the dust that had accumulated around their edges. The following morning, I approached Cardinal Bertoli with my concerns. His office occupies the third floor of the Apostolic Palace, overlooking the courtyard where Renaissance cardinals once debated matters of doctrine under the watchful eyes of Swiss guards. Cardinal Bertoli is a careful man, deliberate in his speech and conservative in his judgments. But when I described the midnight performances, his expression shifted in a way that suggested my report was not entirely unexpected. "Father Dubois," he said, setting down his morning coffee and folding his hands across his desk. "How long have you served in your current position?" 12 years, Your Eminence. "And in all that time, have you ever had reason to question the protocols we maintain for the Sistine Chapel?" I considered his question carefully. "No, Your Eminence. I have always assumed that the restrictions existed for the protection of the sacred space." Cardinal Bertoli nodded slowly. "The chapel has housed many secrets over the centuries, Father. Some of them are preserved in our archives. Others—" He paused, gazing toward the window where morning light filtered through ancient glass. "Others remain active in ways that require our continued vigilance." He opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a leather folder sealed with red wax. "I am going to share something with you that must never be discussed outside this office. In the winter of 1527, during the pontificate of Pope Clement VII, the Sistine Chapel served as temporary housing for a group of orphaned choir boys whose monastery had been destroyed during the sack of Rome. These children, numbering approximately 30, lived in the chamber beneath the organ loft for several months while arrangements were made for their permanent placement. The Cardinal broke the wax seal and withdrew a single sheet of parchment covered in medieval Latin script. According to this document, sealed by papal order and never copied, the children died during an outbreak of plague that winter. They were buried in a mass grave beneath the chapel floor, and their deaths were attributed to natural causes." He looked up at me with eyes that seemed much older than his 63 years. "However, certain irregularities in the timing and circumstances of their deaths raised questions that were never officially investigated." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air flowing through the Cardinal's windows. "What kind of irregularities, Your Eminence?" "The children died over the course of a single night, all 30 of them, with no prior symptoms of illness. The attending physician noted that their bodies showed no external signs of plagono buboes, no fever marks, no evidence of the usual suffering that accompanies such outbreaks." Cardinal Bertoli returned the parchment to its folder and resealed it with fresh wax. "The official record states that they died peacefully in their sleep, singing hymns until the moment of their passing." He stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Since that time, the chapel has experienced periodic disturbances that coincide with certain astronomical conditions. Previous organists have reported similar phenomena to what you described. We maintain our protocols not to prevent these occurrences, but to ensure that they remain contained within the sacred space where they originated." I left Cardinal Bertoli's office with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer understanding of my responsibilities. That evening I returned to the organ chamber and spent several hours researching the musical forms that had characterized liturgical composition during the 1520s. The pieces I had heard the Phantom Choir perform followed exactly the stylistic conventions of that period: modal harmonies, Latin textual settings, the kind of complex polyphony that trained monastery choirs would have mastered through years of daily practice. Over the following months, the midnight performances continued with increasing frequency and intensity. The choir's voices grew more distinct and individual, and I began to recognize recurring melodic patterns that suggested the same group of children singing night after night. Their Latin pronunciation carried the regional accent of central Italy, and their musical phrasing reflected the pedagogical methods used in 16th century religious education. Most disturbing was the evolution in their emotional tone. What had initially sounded like simple sadness gradually transformed into something that resembled desperation. On the night of March 19, 2024, the Feast of St. Joseph, I experienced the final and most unsettling encounter. I had positioned myself once again in the upper gallery, determined to observe the performance more carefully and perhaps identify the source of the voices. The organ began its usual gentle prelude at 11:52, but this time the children's choir entered immediately, without their customary hesitation. They sang a piece I had never heard before, a complex motet, that seemed to combine elements of multiple liturgical forms into a single, unified composition. But as the music progressed, I realized that the children were not simply performing. They were trying to communicate something specific, something urgent, through the careful arrangement of their words and melodies. The Latin text they sang was not from any standard liturgical source. Instead, they repeated phrases that seemed to describe their final night in the chapel, references to the visitor who came after compline, the sweet wine that brought dreams, and the sleep that would not end. As their voices grew more insistent, I began to understand that these children had not died of plague. Someone had deliberately silenced them, and their spirits had remained in the chapel, using the only means available to them, music, to bear witness to the truth of their fate. The performance ended as it always did, with absolute silence returning to the chapel. But this time, as I prepared to leave my hiding place, I heard a single voice, a boy soprano, clear as crystal in the moonlit space, whisper a final phrase in Latin. Memento nos, Pater, remember us. Father, I have continued my duties as senior church musician for the past 4 months, maintaining the organ with the same reverence and precision that my position demands. I no longer attempt to observe the midnight performances, though I hear them still, drifting through the corridors of the Vatican whenever the moon reaches its appointed phase. Cardinal Bertoli has assured me that the children's voices cause no harm to the living, and that their presence in the chapel serves as a form of perpetual prayer for the souls of all who have suffered injustice in sacred spaces. Sometimes, when I am working alone in the organ chamber during the day, I find that certain keys respond with unusual warmth to my touch, as though small hands had recently been resting upon them. And on quiet afternoons, when the tour groups have departed and the chapel sits in its ancient stillness, I play simple hymns that I know the children would have learned during their brief time in this holy place, hoping that somewhere in the space between sound and silence, they can hear that they have not been forgotten. There are 1,743 keys on my master ring, and I know the purpose of every single one. My name is Lorenzo Vega, and I have served as the Vatican's Chief of Security Systems for 22 years. The Holy See entrusts me with access to every chamber, every archive, every sealed door within these sacred walls. It is a responsibility I have never taken lightly. The weight of those keys, both physical and spiritual, has shaped my entire adult life. Each morning at precisely 5:30, I begin my rounds through the Apostolic Palace, checking seals and locks that have remained undisturbed for decades. Some doors I open daily. Others, marked with red wax and papal sigils, I merely inspect, ensuring their copper locks remain untouched and their hinges show no signs of tampering. The rhythm of this work has become a form of prayer for me, a meditation on the mysteries contained within Vatican City's labyrinthine passages. The Vatican operates on protocols established over centuries. Every key is catalogued, every door is mapped. Every chamber has a purpose, even if that purpose has been forgotten by everyone except the Church's most senior archivists. I maintain the Master Registry, a leather-bound ledger that has been updated by security chiefs since 1894. My predecessor, Chief Benedetti, explained during my training that some doors must never be opened, some keys must never be used, and some chambers must never be discussed. These are not suggestions, they are sacred obligations. The first unusual key appeared on my ring 3 weeks ago. I discovered it during my morning inspection of the Borgia apartments, hanging between the key to the defunct papal elevator and the one that opens the sealed wine cellars beneath St. Peter's. The key was brass, unremarkable in design, but it bore no catalog number and appeared in no registry. I examined it carefully under my desk lamp, noting its simple shaft and worn teeth. Someone had used this key frequently, long ago. When I checked my ledger, I found no missing entries, no forgotten chambers, no uncatalogued doors. According to every record in my possession, this key should not exist. I should have reported it immediately to Cardinal Secretary Torretti. Instead, I found myself drawn to the restricted wings after evening vespers, testing the key against locks I had never opened. Most doors rejected it, as expected. But on the third night of searching, I tried the key on a small wooden door in the basement archives beneath the Sistine Chapel. The lock turned with a soft click that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The door opened onto a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I have explored every accessible area of Vatican City during my 2 decades of service. I know which passages connect to the Roman catacombs and which chambers house the Church's most sensitive historical documents. But this staircase was not on any map I had ever seen. The walls were carved from the same stone as St. Peter's foundations, but they felt older somehow, as if they predated the basilica itself. I descended carefully, my flashlight illuminating worn steps that curved downward in a tight spiral. The air grew cooler with each step, carrying the faint scent of beeswax and old parchment. After 57 steps, I counted them carefully, I emerged into a vast chamber that should have been impossible. It was another version of the Vatican secret archives. The layout was identical to the archives I knew, but everything was different. The shelving units were made of darker wood, carved with symbols that seemed familiar yet wrong. The ceiling vaults bore frescoes I had never seen, depicting saints I could not identify. And throughout the chamber, Vatican staff members went about their work with silent efficiency. I recognized them. Brother Castellani, who had died of a heart attack in 2007, was carefully rebinding a manuscript at his old desk. Sister Margherita, who had passed away in 2012, was cataloging documents with the same meticulous attention to detail she had shown in life. Monsignor Ricci, dead for 15 years, was reviewing access requests with his characteristic furrowed brow. None of them acknowledged my presence. They continued their work as if trapped in an eternal moment, repeating the same careful motions they had performed thousands of times during their service to the Church. Brother Castellani's hands moved in the exact rhythm I remembered, turning pages with the same gentle reverence. Sister Margherita wrote in her ledger with the same precise script, but when I looked closer, I saw she was writing the same entry over and over again. I watched them for nearly an hour before returning to the surface, my mind struggling to process what I had witnessed. The dead do not simply continue their earthly duties. Yet these were not spirits or apparitions. They moved with the weight and substance of living people, performing their sacred tasks with the same devotion they had shown in life. The second key appeared 4 days later. Then, a third. Each new key opened another door, another staircase, another impossible chamber. I discovered a version of the papal apartments from the 1950s, where monsignors who had died decades ago continued preparing documents for Pope Pius XII. I found a recreation of the old Vatican Observatory, where Jesuit astronomers who had passed away in the 80s were still calculating planetary positions on equipment that no longer existed above ground. Each chamber contained Vatican staff members I had known, respected, even befriended during my years of service. They were all performing their final duties, locked in temporal loops that seemed to repeat endlessly. Cardinal Bertone, who had died just 2 years ago, was eternally reviewing security protocols in an office identical to the one he had occupied in life. His lips moved silently as he read, and his fingers traced the same paragraphs I had seen him study countless times during his final months of service. The keys kept appearing. My ring grew heavier each morning, weighted down by brass and copper keys that bore no catalog numbers and opened doors that should not exist. I began to understand that these were not separate chambers but layers of the Vatican itself, temporal echoes preserved in stone and shadow. Each era of service left its mark, and those who had devoted their lives to the Church continued that devotion beyond death. Last night, I discovered the most disturbing chamber yet. The newest key opened a door in the papal apartments that led to an exact replica of my own office. Every detail was perfect: my desk, my files, my carefully maintained key registry. But the man sitting at my desk was not me. He was older, grayer, wearing the same uniform, but bearing the weight of additional years. He was updating the registry with the same careful script I used, recording the same information I had recorded just hours before. I watched myself for some future version of myself continue the eternal duty of cataloging keys and maintaining locks. The older Lorenzo moved with the mechanical precision I recognized from the other chambers, trapped in the rhythm of sacred service. He lifted his head as if sensing my presence, and our eyes met across time. He smiled sadly and pointed to his key ring. Then he held up a single brass keywone I had never seen before and placed it carefully on the desk. When I returned to my office this morning, the key was waiting for me, already on my ring as if it had always been there. According to my registry, it unlocks a door I have never found, in a chamber that does not exist on any Vatican map. I know now that my service to the Church will continue long after my earthly duties end. The Vatican remembers its faithful servants, preserving their devotion in stone and shadow. Chief Benedetti understood this when he trained me. His predecessor understood it as well. We are not simply guardians of keys and chambers, we are guardians of time itself, ensuring that the sacred work continues across generations. Tonight, during evening vespers, I will search for the door that fits this final key. I suspect I already know what I will find behind it. Security Chief Lorenzo Vega submitted his final key registry report on March 15, 2024. He was found peacefully at his desk the following morning, having died during the night of apparent natural causes. His replacement, Chief Maria Santos, reports that all security protocols remain unchanged, and all keys have been properly cataloged. No irregularities have been noted in the master registry.